Endor, they're going to be good this year.
Good afternoon, everyone. I call to order the February 2022 meeting of the Finance and Operations Committee of the University of Minnesota Board of Regents. Thank you to those who are joining us via the live stream video and those attending in our boardroom or via Zoom. Let me welcome our student representatives for today, Cal Mergendahl from the Morris campus and Flora Vang from the Twin Cities campus. Thank you, everyone, for being with us today. The first item on our agenda has to do with the ongoing impacts of COVID-19 on the university finances. Our presenters are Senior Vice President Myron Franz and Vice President Julie Thompson. To start us off, I would invite Senior Vice President Franz and Vice President Thompson to provide the update. Senior Vice President Franz, would you like to begin?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair, and good afternoon, members of the board and President Gable. The first agenda item, as Chair Mayron mentioned, is a summary of the impacts of COVID on our budget during the last several years. I'll mention the time frame in just a moment. You'll recall that last fall we came to you with a discussion about the operational effects of COVID and how we were dealing with those issues. But now we want to talk to you today about the last several months of fiscal 20 for all of fiscal 21 and an estimate of what we are experiencing right now during fiscal 22. Now, in addition, we'll provide more detail on the federal relief awards that the university received to help offset some, but not all, of the pandemic budget impacts. So, Madam Chair, with your permission, I'll turn it over to Vice President Julie Thompson to go forward.
Excuse me.
Bless you, Madam.
Thank you. Thank you. Vice President Thompson, if you would like to proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. I will start our summary today by looking at just the two closed fiscal years during this time period that Senior Vice President Franz mentioned. And on this slide, you can see that the total pandemic-driven shortfall that we defined and tracked during this period, March of 2020 through June of 2021, totaled $214 million. Originally, and last reported to you last fall, the estimate for FY21 alone was $173 million. The only thing that changed that dropped it down to 149 is that final reconciliation on the Twin Cities athletics total, which, as you remember from last fall, was $21.5 million related to the loan. We were originally estimating it at $45 million. So when we finally learned it was 21.5, we made that adjustment. And so this now is the final total for that time period. We addressed that shortfall, the total 214, in a variety of ways. These 6 items here are the tools we used during the time to address the challenge. We implemented, and some of these overlap a bit, so I will explain that as I go, but we implemented the furlough temporary pay reduction program and realized the savings from that in 2 different ways. Most of the savings hit our academic units. So we were able to apply the savings from the furlough and temporary pay reduction program directly to the units where the challenges were. But we also recognized savings from that program in our central support units who did not have a financial challenge from the pandemic. The budget office is a good example of that. And so the third bullet from the bottom here references the fact that we transferred savings from our central support units to many of our academic units throughout the system to help solve the challenges where they were. A second tool we used was the federal relief funds, which I will explain in more detail here coming up. A third tool was balances and reserves throughout the institution. And here too, there are 2 bullets that refer to this because some of the balances were in units out distributed and also some of the reserves. They had set aside funds for unanticipated revenue losses that were then available. And we also used the university central reserves. As you are aware, you approved the distribution or allocation of $35 million of central reserves over the time period that the pandemic has been in play to address shortfalls. And let me mention here, just as an aside, it is apparent from the Central Reserves report that is in your docket item your docket materials, that the balance of central reserves is estimated to be very low, right now as a result of this spend down of $35 million. We are working on plans to restore central reserves back up to a level that would be appropriate again. And we're looking at various options, and we'll report back to you with the May budget on our plans to restore central reserves. That's a normal part of the budget document. We estimate the activity for central reserves, as well as the projections for the next fiscal year and the plans around it. So we will do that when we bring the budget to you in May. I just wanted to make that aside, because central reserves was an important part of being able to address the COVID shortfalls. And then finally, the last tool we have here is the loan. And we use that only in one place, for Twin Cities Athletics, and that was approved last fall. In summary form, you can see on one page here what was driving that $214 million shortfall. What was driving it is on the left, predominantly loss of revenues due to reduced activities, fewer buyers for many of our services and goods, fewer students. On the right, it details the solutions. Those are the 6 bullets I just talked through, but combined into 4 categories here. The largest support for the solutions came from unit level and central balances and reserves, then the federal relief funds, then the furlough temporary pay reduction program, and finally the loan to athletics. There were other expense reductions that occurred naturally through reduced activity and as a result of decisions that we made. For example, the decision to implement a hiring freeze and the retirement incentive option. As we've discussed before, the impact of those was not realized equally across the institution, but where it did occur, the immediate savings from those decisions helped to build up the balances and reserves that are referenced here. The ongoing impact of the RIO, for example, and the hiring freeze, so if we didn't fill a position, the ongoing savings from that actually helped us balance the FY22 budget, the recurring budget for FY22 and into FY23 and beyond. I do want to spend just a few minutes on the federal relief aid that the university has received and remind everyone the federal funds were specifically to address impacts of the pandemic, not to fund whatever is something we might have wanted to do at the time. We received the funding in 3 different buckets. The Coronavirus Aid Relief and Economic Securities, or CARES Act, that was enacted in the spring of 2020. The Corona Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriation, or CRISA Act, passed in January of 21, and the American Rescue Plan, ARP Act, passed in March of 21. In total, the university received roughly $190 million from the primary awards in those 3 acts. 104.4 of that was specifically for institutional relief. I'll talk about the student portion here on the next slide. And you can see here some other points that we've made along the way. It's one-time money, cannot be used to support the ongoing needs of the institution and so forth. From the beginning, we have implemented the use of these dollars in compliance with the federal guidelines, which is often challenging. And we are anticipating, though, at some point that there could be an audit or other follow-up by the federal government to assure the appropriate use of the funds. I should also make clear that each act provided specific and separate dollar awards to the Crookston, Duluth, Morris, and the combined Twin Cities and Rochester campuses. The dollar amounts by campus could not be changed. We can't break them up or allocate them differently. Each campus has received its specific amount from each of the 3 acts. Since this is a presentation about the university's operating budget primarily, I will only briefly mention the student aid portion of the awards to kind of close that loop. The 3 acts are here with the dollar amounts we received. These are the minimum amounts that had to go to students as direct payments. They could not be applied to the student's outstanding tuition bill, for example. They had to go as checks, payments to students, so the students could choose how to use the money. In all cases, for the CARES Act and the CRISA Act, the funds have been fully distributed out to students. For the ARP Act, which as you can see is larger, A good chunk of that went out in the fall of this academic year, and the other portion is going out now as we speak, actually, this spring. We are distributing it primarily in two ways, all of these funds. First, the majority of the funds has gone out as block grants to students based on their financial need. Automatic, they don't have to apply. We use FAFSA information and distribute it out on a sliding scale. The other piece is that each campus had a designated amount for emergency funds. These were not to be based on income. Students fill out a form, simple form, indicate in various categories what they need the money for, the dollar amount, and they will get an award that way. So those are the two pieces that distributed the student portion. Turning to the institutional portion of the relief aid, here again, we have the three buckets. The CARES Act, 17.8 million, was distributed out to our units 100% in FY20, so in those first few months of the pandemic. The 37.4 million, the entire amount of the CRRSA Act, has also been distributed. That was done to address FY21 shortfalls prior to July 1 of 2021. And the ARP Act, we split into two pieces. 22.6 million was combined with the CRRSA money in FY21 and helped units that year. And we held 26.6 million to be distributed this year, anticipating we would have continuing shortfalls, which we have, and I'll explain in a moment. But 100% of the federal dollars have now been allocated out to solve or a portion of the shortfalls that we have had each year. And I will summarize, starting on this slide, the solutions by year. So jumping back for a summary of the FY20 shortfall, over half of that shortfall was related to auxiliary revenue losses. And most of that due to the refunds that we implemented for students and for their housing and dining contracts. But it also included parking and bookstore losses and so forth. Also miscellaneous sales, Northrop Auditorium ticket sales, Bell Museum, the rec center fees and so forth. It was a sudden, abrupt end to activities that resulted in less revenues than budgeted that year, while the expenditures had already taken place or had to continue through the end of the fiscal year. We couldn't react quickly enough to reduce expenses in that case. The solutions, over half, as 71%, the majority of the solutions here came from university budget cuts and reserves. That includes 22 million of the $35 million authorization from central reserves, but also other expenditure reductions where they could happen in units, as well as the use of balances in units. The CARES Act made up 27% of our solution that year. And then each year there is a targeted federal grant bucket. And I mentioned earlier that we received funding, institutional funding, our primary sources from the federal acts. Each federal act also has some carve-outs for very specific types of activities. This represents two categories where the dollars could be used and have been used to replace operating losses. For our clinics is one of those. So Boynton, Kook, the Duluth Health Clinic and so forth received a targeted award from the federal government. And in addition, the Morris campus has received institutional support funding because they are designated a strengthening Asian American and Native American Pacific Islander serving institution. And because of that designation, they have received these dollars that they could then apply to their general operating losses. I'll mention very quickly, the Twin Cities also has that designation, but it gets a lower dollar amount and made the decision to distribute those funds to students rather than to the institution. I can show the same slide, summary type graph for FY21 here. Again, the shortfall, 149 million in this case, was driven by revenue losses, continued in auxiliaries primarily, as well as miscellaneous revenue categories. Over half of the $149 million shortfall is a result of auxiliary losses, 85 million, compared to what a normal year would have been. But also for FY21 new, which we didn't have in FY20, We had the tuition losses and the Twin Cities athletic losses, again, because activities were drastically reduced and we didn't take in the revenues that we anticipated. Here again, the largest portion of the solution to the 149 million was university budget cuts and reserves. That was the furlough temporary pay reduction program at over 24 million, unit level balances around 38 million, and another portion of that central reserves, 35 million, about 4.5 million of it makes up that 66.6. The second largest contributor here was the federal dollars, all of CRRSA and a portion of ARP that you see. You have the 21.5 million loan to Twin Cities Athletics and the targeted federal grants again here, slightly less amount at $800,000. So those are the finished fiscal years. We're done. Those are the reports from the activity for those 2 years. That allows us to move to an update of what we're seeing this year. But before we get to the unanticipated impacts, I want to make clear that we did estimate changes in both revenues and expenses as part of finalizing this year's FY22 budget. The units did reduce revenues in their budget where they anticipated activities would be down, and then they had to reduce expenses or generate other revenues to make that up. That is in this year's budget. You can see some of the tools over on the right that were used to help do that. Expense reductions, including the RIO and the elimination of positions. We had other revenue gains in some cases where they moved activities virtually and started selling things differently, rate adjustments, and the use of balances where it was appropriate, where we think that the shortfall is more of a one-time or non-recurring item. So all of those things were incorporated into this year's budget, but there are places where we have seen and are seeing some unanticipated or unbudgeted impacts. To find them, we went through yet another review with all of our units. We surveyed all of them and ultimately met with 17 to better understand what was driving the shortfalls they're seeing. In tuition, we estimated so far that about $5.5 million is a shortfall for the system campuses and $10 million for the Twin Cities campus. We pushed them a bit on whether these shortfalls really were as a result of the pandemic or not, but we do have some there's no proof, of course, but we do have anecdotal information, and we also are seeing some abnormal types of patterns in retention and drop-off rates during the year and registrations. So there is evidence that it is related to the pandemic. Auxiliaries, again, fewer students than projected and still more choosing to leave than in prior years. And of course, we have reduced activities and fewer people on campus, which impacts parking and bookstores. And the other miscellaneous revenue, again, some of the activities are coming back slower than we anticipated. So they're doing a little worse than we thought. We also have some emerging capacity issues in things like the child care center, in the veterinary medical center, where they cannot serve as many people as we would like to do because of staffing issues and or space considerations are different than what was planned. And finally, there are some expenses that we're estimating related to masking and testing yet this year. So we will circle back this spring to finalize this information and to really make sure that we are not missing any significant shortfalls. All of these things, by the way, all these activities are doing better than last year. And I think that that's important to understand. They're just worse than we anticipated, a little bit worse than we anticipated. So solutions to the 38.5 million that we're anticipating this year, here the reserved ARP funds will address more than half of the anticipated shortfall. Now, if we find more this spring and the shortfall increases, there is no more federal money. So that 69% will be reduced. But as of today, this is our plan and our estimate. Those funds have all been allocated out. In addition, we have the small amount of targeted federal grants, again, that will be gone. And we have some balances that we'll have to use again. We are still hopeful or projecting that activity levels will pick up, perhaps not to pre-COVID levels in all of these cases, but back to the conservative budget that we set for this year. I think that's a real possibility in many, if not most of the cases. For tuition and some of the auxiliary revenues, Past this year, we're going to have to think about enrollment changes separate from COVID, I think. I don't believe there will be continued pandemic-driven direct impacts, that it's just going to be what it is. So lower enrollment levels will happen for many reasons, as they do off and on in units every year, and we're just going to have to work to rebuild them, which is actually a good segue to the final slide. So in looking beyond this year, in some cases, from a budgetary perspective, we have to simply move to a new base. In some units, enrollment may take time to rebound. Some activities just will not see the same level of sales that they did in the past. For example, moving to virtual is here to stay in some of our activities, which is a good thing, as you've heard in some cases. But that might mean a different revenue mix for those activities. And of course, we've likely added some new expenditures to our annual supplies budget with masking and testing and classroom equipment and so forth. We will not have any more federal relief, at least to our knowledge today. We will not have central reserves allocated for this purpose beyond what has already been done. So our choices to solve any kind of the financial situation moving forward are the same as they have been in the past. We will need to grow revenues or reduce expenditures. It's that simple. That's what we will embed into the FY23 budget and each budget beyond. And I'm hoping that these updates related to COVID will be a thing of the past. So with that, Chair Mayron, we are happy to entertain any questions.
All right, thank you. Well, we'll open this up for discussion, and while I'm waiting to see if we have anyone, my colleagues who would like to participate, let me ask one question. There's a slide, it was page 14 of our materials. It's the student portion of the relief aid, where it talks about, yep, there it is, the CARES Act, the CRISA Act, which have already been distributed. So with the ARP Act, some was distributed in the fall of 2021, the balance in 2022. What happens if a student who was here, say during 2020, is not here in the fall of 2021, or is not here in the spring of 2022? Are distributions being made to those students, or only if they're currently enrolled at the time of distribution?
Yes, Madam Chair, it is only if they are enrolled in the term that we're distributing the funds.
Okay. All right. Any questions or discussions? Regent Sviggum.
Thank you, Chair Mayron. Julie, a question on the slide, page 11, where we talked about the solutions to the COVID financial consequence.
Yep.
I was surprised that you did not put a bullet point there for hiring freeze suddenly changed to pause. And I know that you explained it a little bit later in another slide, but talk to me about the hiring pause, and is it still reflected in our FTEs as a university right now? If I ask VP Horstman what our FTE count was right now, would he tell me it's 872 FTEs less than it was pre-COVID?
Yes. Madam Chair, Regent Sviggum, first, let me say that the reason it's not identified here is, and it could have been, but what that ended up doing is creating a savings, a balance in the unit that's reflected in the balances unit reserves line here. It's just a different way to capture it, but it's using freed up funds on a one-time basis to address the shortfall. So that's where it's intended to be. It wasn't across the board. All units did not benefit from that particular decision, but where they did, it created some balances which then were used. So that's how I would respond to that. In terms of the number, I anticipate, yes, that we are still down in FTE, but Vice President Horstman would have to provide the actual numbers. I don't know where we sit today. But listening to the units, I know there is evidence that we are down. And so a lot of that is permanent in the fact that we eliminated positions and captured those savings on a recurring basis in this year's budget, in the FY22 budget, as part of the reallocation plan.
Thank you.
Sure.
Any follow-up, Regent Sviggum?
No.
All right.
Sure.
Regent Farnsworth?
Thank you, Chair Mayron, and thank you, Associate Vice President Tonneson, for this great and informative presentation. I'd actually go back to the slide Chair Mayron was talking about, page 14 in our docket, the student portion of relief aid. And just say, one, appreciated the update on this because I was kind of curious on where that was at. And I've heard nothing but positive feedback from students about experience applying for that and the fact that was offered and that it was easy to interact with. So thanks to everyone who was involved with that. I'd be curious, and I don't know, who exactly this would be directed to or which department would do this, but some future analysis of what those block grants and emergency student support grants looked like from a topical standpoint, understanding, kind of doing an analysis of student need there and what ended up happening with that, understanding that I'm sure a lot of them were, extenuating circumstances due to the nature of what this relief aid was. But I'd be kind of curious on what lessons we can learn from, as an institution around how students tapped into this, identify trends. I'm sure this is already being done, but just wanted to highlight that as we go forward and kind of reflect on how this relief aid was allocated to students and what lessons we can learn from what students were requesting. We can identify other priorities based on what that need was. So thank you.
Vice President Tonneson.
Madam Chair, Regent Farnsworth, I do want to say that where we do have data, yes, there would be analysis on that. And that would be primarily in the emergency grant portion where they have to indicate the purpose of the funds they're requesting. But the block grants were just payments to students based on their income. We are not collecting information from them for those. It's an automatic payment out. So we wouldn't have anything in our system today to do any reporting on the use of those dollars, nor and according to the federal government, it could just go for whatever need they have, and they did not have to report that back.
All right, thank you. Regent Hipsch.
Thanks, Chair Mayron. So great information, great presentation. I think the one thing that caused me to lose sleep is I'm scared that we're going to cut our budget in areas that's going to cut our revenue further. So, I mean, it's a lot of times they'll do this where they'll cut their marketing budget and then their sales go down and they wonder why their sales go down, but their discretionary spending was in marketing, right? So I'm thinking we have to go the other way in marketing to keep up with everybody else in the area. If you know what I'm saying. I've seen ads for everyone. And so I just want to be very cautious about that we're spending not only a lot more than last year, that we keep that in our budget. So just like to hear your comments on that, especially for our rural campuses. I think it's really important. So.
Senior Vice President Franz.
Okay.
Madam Chair, thank you, and Regent Hipsch, thank you. That is the key, isn't it? And is being strategic about what it is we do. And I think one of the things that we've learned in this process is that and all the units should be credited with taking a really tough lens to what they do and how they do it, and what can they commit to and what can they stop doing that they don't need to do anymore. I mean, we all talk about those kinds of things, but so I think that process of analysis and introspection was very, very helpful. And we went through how many different cycles in 21, 22, Judy, like several processes we went through in the fall and in the spring. Is this really what's happening? And how quickly is it happening? And what can you do? So that process has, I think, been very helpful. But you're right, though, on the strategic side, though, that we don't want to, do things that will in the long term affect the ability to attract students, to attract research grants and revenue. One of the things that I was most surprised about was the ability of research to continue on during the pandemic and meet the requirements of a lot of those different research grants to keep the grants going, keep satisfying those grants, and then get more grants. So that turned out to work out better than I thought might originally happen. But we will continue to analyze, and part of the 2025 plan is for us to come to you about developing new revenues and making sure that we think about that in a strategic way. So we take very seriously these questions, and I appreciate your perspective. And we'll try to make sure we keep you informed of how do we recommend we make those decisions going forward.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Chair Powell.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Mayron, and thanks, Julie. Just a quick one on the athletics program, since they're, that debt that they took on was so significant. Do you just recall offhand, what that takes their overall level of indebtedness to now? I know it's over 100 million, but adding 20, I'm just curious about where they're sitting now. And the other question I have is, do we have a sense for whether their revenues, have recovered? Are they kind of back to where they were? I know that the program overall is still running at a deficit, but just any observations that you have on, how well the revenue part recovered?
Vice President Tonneson.
Chair Mayron, Regent Powell. I'm sorry I don't have here today with me their total level of indebtedness now. I do have it in my office. But you're right, it was over 100 million. I don't have the number with me today.
Okay.
I will tell you that we are working with them regularly to understand what's going on with their budget and to estimate into the future. And so we are constantly updating the information about debt that's being paid off versus new and so forth. So I will have that, but I just don't have it today. In terms of how they're recovering, you notice I didn't mention them as part of the $38.5 million projection for the current year. And that's because we are right now estimating them in a range of outcomes for this year. Actually, a range that is slightly positive. So
Great.
more than breaking even, maybe slightly positive, to up to maybe $7 or $8 million negative. But it is so dependent on how the rest of the seasons play out and what happens with the Final Four, for example, the TV revenues, some other pieces that are in their budget. So we're watching very carefully, but felt that a zero estimate at this point is okay and appropriate. And that's the combination of better than anticipated revenues, or a return of some revenues, as well as some dropping off of expenses. I mean, it's a combination of those things.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other regents who wish to weigh in, or student representatives? All right, that concludes our discussion on this topic, but don't go away, Vice President Tonneson, because you are next up for discussion is the fiscal year 2023 annual operating budget framework. And again, I invite Vice President Tonneson to take us through the presentation. And if you would like to first introduce the item.
Madam Chair, I'll go ahead and make the introduction. I'll give Vice President Tonneson a moment to rest. This next agenda item is really further preparation for the discussion we're all going to have, a very difficult and challenging discussion we're going to have in May about the budget for fiscal 23. So today, the purpose of our review is really to focus on 4 different areas. Number one, we want to make sure that we talk about the budget framework as a tool for making budget decisions. We want your input. We want your suggestions. Number two, the estimates of what we are seeing in anticipated growth in required expenditures, including a focus on how inflation factors in. Obviously, a lot of discussion about inflation, how it affects us and our expenditures, so it's an important part of the budget process. Number three, we want to give you some more information on revenue growth estimates and choices, including a focus on how recent gains in endowment earnings can factor into budget planning. And then number four, we want to explain and give you examples of how the budget variables can be put together in a framework plan as you all think about approaching the budget process in May. And with that, Madam Chair, I'll let Vice President Tonneson take over.
All right, Vice President Tonneson.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. To set the stage for this conversation, I want to visually remind everyone what we mean when we talk about the budget framework. At its most basic level, it is simply an equation identifying planned or expected increases in resources that must be equal to or greater than planned expenditures. It is a form of incremental budgeting at a very high level. The foundational understanding in it is that the base budget is balanced. So we can focus our time and effort on making sure that the incremental changes to that remain balanced. The decisions we bring here are focused on the O&M state appropriation and tuition funds, because that is where leadership decisions have the most impact. I do want to remind everyone that we do not ignore the other roughly 60% of the revenues in the budget. As I will point out in an upcoming slide, those revenues are an important part of the overall budget, but the decisions to be made to finalize the budget simply do not fall there as part of this process with leadership. To make this part of the budget come alive a little bit, I want to share with you two quick views. Actual examples of the approved FY22 budget in a framework format. First, the state O&M and tuition focused framework that you approved for this year. You can see the incremental changes in resources, and please note the $9.6 million unit revenue increases because I will refer to that again shortly. And you can see the planned incremental new spending. You can also see that the decisions we made to get to these summarized totals maintains a balanced budget. Because as I mentioned just a moment ago, we were working from a balanced base. And these changes, if they actually occurred as planned, would add $800,000 to our structurally positive recurring balance. And for the second view, from attachment 2 to the approved FY22 budget, the display of all revenues, state appropriation and tuition, plus those revenues beyond the planning framework. These are not the incremental changes for the year, but instead represent the new totals for all funds after the incremental changes have been incorporated. For the primary framework funds highlighted in yellow, the results flow from decisions made by the state on our appropriations and by this board regarding tuition rates, and that's 41% of our projected revenues for the year. For the other funds, the results flow from decisions made by this board related to rates and fees, plus our high-level estimates of changes in the other revenues based on trends and projections built from conversation with the units generating them. So for example, as I mentioned in the previous presentation, it includes estimates of lower than pre-pandemic levels of some activities as units are still building back to normal levels. What I'm hoping is evident here is that the budget framework is helpful in getting to this level of detail and displaying the budget in a meaningful format. Talking through the incremental changes to apply to the base to then arrive at the new fully projected revenue and expenditure base requires the conversations like we are having today. As Myron mentioned at the beginning, we thought it would be helpful to spend just a couple of minutes on a breakdown of endowment earnings in particular, as one component of total revenues and an example of how these pieces actually all come together. Because of the previously communicated great returns that our Chief Investment Officer and his team achieved in FY21, we thought it would be helpful to provide some information and context around how those returns impact the operating budget. As the slide indicates, based on current assumptions of a consolidated endowment fund investment performance of 7% going forward, and the continued payout of 4.5%, the annual distribution of these funds to the university departments, the maroon line, is estimated to grow from $73.8 million this year to $103.7 million in FY26. That is a $29.9 million or 40% growth in the annual distributions over this time period. That's $7 to $8 million incremental growth each year. And for context, just prior to the pandemic, the growth in the annual distribution to university departments over the previous 4-year period, FY16 to FY20, was $10 million or 19%, a $2 to $3 million annual growth rate. So this is a significant increase. The foundation is estimating a similar pattern in the funds available for distribution from the endowment managed by them. It should be a slightly lower rate of growth, but the same pattern. We do not have a similar set of multi-year projections from them at this point. These endowment funds are largely restricted to particular units and or purposes. Our financial managers in the units benefiting from these funds are aware of the projected growth and the expenses they are allowed to apply it to. At that point, they have to make decisions about how much of the distribution they want to record as spendable revenue in the year, how much they want to take in, and how much, if any, they want to reinvest back into the endowment. For example, if an endowment was established to support a faculty chair, it's possible that the payouts have not yet reached a level necessary to support a meaningful portion of that faculty member's compensation, and the position may be unfilled. In those scenarios, the unit may decide to reinvest the distribution, helping the principal to grow and build a larger return in the future. For the majority of the funds, however, the units will accept the full distribution and apply the revenue growth to one of three things: inflationary cost increases on the existing items funded by the distribution, compensation, for example, expanded spending on program enhancements as allowed, more scholarships, as an example, or shifted costs from other funds. In some cases, within the restrictions set out by the donor, units can move existing expenses to the increased endowment earnings, either a larger portion of an existing position or a whole new position, for example. Units will plan and communicate these changes as part of addressing their budget needs for next year, which helps them balance the budget framework within that unit. It may show up then as part of the $9.6 million unit revenues line on this slide. And whatever the total estimates of this revenue are estimated to be will then show up on the gifts and endowment income line of this slide. By and large, this incremental $7 to $8 million growth each year can be spent on faculty chairs, student employees supporting research or instruction, or scholarships based on donor intent. Those are the three primary things that donors provide the funding for. So it's not available for general distribution by the institution, but does support the budget of those units. Transitioning now to focus on plans related to the state O&M appropriation and tuition. You have seen this before and will likely see it again, because building the framework is an iterative process of asking and answering questions about what to plan as the incremental changes for each major resource and each major expenditure category. The types of questions outlined here. For FY23, we already know our state appropriation in law, but how does the supplemental request play into our planning, if at all? What are our goals for tuition rate changes and internal reallocations? What are the goals for salary increases and strategic initiatives, and so on? We started the conversation on these questions last month. You might remember I took some notes, but the first or second time through in answering these questions often leaves us with an imbalanced budget still. So we have to go back and make adjustments until the final plans balance the budget in a way that addresses the university's goals in the best way possible. Given that task before us, today we want to share the next iteration of information that might help in having the conversation and building the estimates necessary to pull it all together. And we'll start with expenditure projections and a brief discussion about inflation. The primary inflation indices we use to monitor what is going on in the economy and to project future spending obligations are listed here. There are more than one, and actually more than these, if you look into it, because they are calculated in different ways to emphasize different variables within the overall indices. For example, the CPI measures changes in costs for a market basket of goods purchased by US consumers. It's based on a consumer survey, and it incorporates a quality adjustment to acknowledge changes in the value or quality of what is purchased. The PCEI also measures changes in cost for a market basket of goods purchased by US consumers, but they rely on industry analysis of pricing versus consumer surveys, and they factor in an adjustment for changes in consumer behavior or consumption due to the higher prices. And finally, the Higher Education Price Index, or HEPI, measures changes in cost for goods and services purchased by colleges and universities specifically, reflecting the larger impact of faculty salaries, for example, compared to items such as food and beverages, apparel, and recreation, which are more dominant in the other indices. You can see the most recent published inflation rates for each of the indexes here. The HEPI rate here is rather out of date because it's published only once per year, and the economy has changed considerably since last spring. But the other two have been trending up monthly and have reached levels we haven't seen since the 1970s and 80s. Many predict the rates will begin to stabilize or trend down by the end of the calendar year, but they will remain higher than we have had to manage in many years. Now, how does that impact our budget? For many universities, and us included, we know our budget is driven by compensation. Currently, we are hearing anecdotes and predictions of wage increases in private industry exceeding 5%. Public employers and nonprofit organizations will likely not go quite that high perhaps, but all indications are that compensation will increase more than it has in many years, potentially in the 3 to 5% range for many. Information from our peers, where and when, and if we can get it, and the new published HEPI data this spring could help us in planning for the next several years related to compensation. Beyond compensation, our spending falls in groupings that we handle a little bit differently in the budget process. I explained this in more depth in the docket item summary on page 24 of your docket materials. But very quickly, for general supplies and equipment, things like paper, pens, laptops, et cetera, we can expect the price increases we see in the general economy, running 5 to 7% right now, but expected to moderate some for next year. We ask units to handle these within their current base budget, which means they may be buying less or buying differently or accessing balances or unanticipated revenue growth to cover those higher costs. For many of the annual or regular purchases somewhat unique to an institution such as ours, and often unique to specific units within the university, our spending has been increasing faster than the rate of inflation, even before the pandemic, due to increased scope, buying more perhaps, and increased cost inflation. For example, the average annual increase from FY17 to FY21, with some strange ups and downs perhaps due to COVID in that time frame, for lab supplies like chemicals, reagents, and gases, the increase has been 6.4%. For animal care and feeding, it's been 5.3%. For insurance, 4%. For software-related expenses, 11.4%. And for library acquisitions, it's been 5.7%. For these and other items experiencing significant cost growth, we ask the units to surface issues that are problematic or challenging for them to manage within their budget during our annual oversight meeting. As part of developing the budget then, we assess if we should allocate a portion of our strategic investment pool planned in the budget framework to address these costs, or if we should ask the units to reallocate more within their own budgets to handle them. Due to the large variability in these costs between units, we do not apply a single inflation rate against each component of our spending and automatically apply the same solution. It is a more targeted and refined process of incorporating cost increases into our planning by unit and opportunity. And it starts with the core. For budget planning, we often think of our expenditures in two groups. These must-dos to keep our current operations in a strong position that you see on this slide, and then strategic programmatic investment. In this core category here, the primary spending obligations center around these three categories. For FY23, compensation will remain our most significant spending category. And as we started to hear in December, providing meaningful pay increases to our employees is a priority for many. We must remember that whatever plans we implement for pay increases impacts all of our funds. So while here we might talk about how to cover these costs in the framework through internal budget cutting, tuition increases, or state appropriation increases, we have to ask all the other revenue generating activities to cover whatever the cost will be through increased revenues where possible or budget cuts. The fringe rate increase alone, without a salary increase, will cost an estimated $26 million spread across all those other funds next year. In the state and tuition funds, you might remember that we planned a higher fringe cost in FY22 than we are actually realizing in order to have recurring funds available for this large FY23 increase that we knew was going to happen. So in those funds, the incremental increase is just $4 million. Then on top of that fringe increase, each 1% increase in the salary pool will add another $10 million in cost in other funds and $12 million in the state and tuition funds. For facilities and technology infrastructure, it looks like our required inflationary type increases will be relatively low for next year, $1 to $2 million, because debt service and leases will be down, utilities and new building operations will be up, but less than in previous years. That does not include investments to enhance services or address major compliance or safety issues. That's just the regular kind of keep the lights on and the engines running type of cost increase. Additions beyond that will fall in the category for strategic investment on the next slide. And finally, as we discussed a moment ago related to inflation, for the supplies equipment category, Here, if the cost increases are minimal, units will manage them within the normal ups and downs in their budget. If the projected cost increases in this area are significant for some, they become part of our discussion about the strategic investments, which is addressed here on this slide. An important budget variable for any university is what it plans for advancing the work of the institution to the next level in terms of quality, impact, service, and so on. If we could plan for an investment pool beyond costs of $20 million each year, we would be able to address the high priority items in this bucket. In years of more limited resource gains, it's only the most critical needs and opportunities that can be accommodated. The combined impact of all the other variables directly impacts the level of new spending in this category. If a large investment in salary increases is a priority, for example, then this investment pool for other programmatic initiatives will necessarily be smaller given the available resources. And that will become apparent when we look at the last slide in this deck. And that's a good transition to the resource side of the framework. As this slide shows, the state appropriation for the last 3 biennia has grown slowly, but intermittently. Any gains have been realized in year 1 of the biennium with little to no growth in the second year. We know the appropriation for FY23. In law, the appropriation does not grow, as you can see here on the right side of the chart. However, as you may recall, of the $18 million recurring increase for FY22, our approved budget only incorporated $15.5 million. Therefore, for budget planning purposes, we have $2.5 million of new recurring state appropriation that has remained uncommitted and is available for allocation beginning in FY23. The supplemental request to the state for FY23 contains $75 million of recurring operating dollars, $10 million for support of safety and security items, and $65 million for student services and student aid. If any amount of those proposals is approved, we will incorporate the new revenue and commit it to the items it is being requested for. Therefore, it does not really impact our conversations about balancing the FY23 budget. Over the last almost 10 years, and heightened really the last couple, the university has had very modest goals related to changes in tuition rates, recognizing the concerns of students and families related to the price of attaining a post-baccalaureate degree. For resident undergraduate tuition rates, we have worked to hold the rate increases at or below the rates of inflation. This is particularly relevant for the Crookston, Duluth, Morris, and Rochester campuses as they face a very competitive recruitment environment. The average annual increase in our resident tuition rates since FY13 has been 1.3% for the Twin Cities campus and 0.6 and 0.7% for our system campuses. Our strategy for the Twin Cities non-resident non-reciprocity rate has differed from that for the resident rate. Prior to the pandemic, we increased this rate significantly for incoming freshmen while holding the rate increases for continuing students to no more than 5.5% each year. This strategy moved the rate to the middle of the Big Ten, 8 of 14, just before the pandemic. But while we held our rates flat last year and increased them only 1.5% this year, the 2 schools with rates just under ours did not follow that same path. They implemented rate increases, so now we are back to 10th out of 14 in that particular comparison group. Given the move for more students to want to enroll closer to home, recruiting in this space has remained challenging. Finally, the goal for graduate and professional rates has generally been to hold increases to around the rate of inflation, with variations driven by market considerations, student debt load, program rankings, and so forth. Added all together, assuming stable enrollment, a 1% increase across all rates is estimated to generate $9.5 million for next year. The question we face, what should we plan for each of these rate categories? Finally, on the resource side, we need to decide how much reallocation is necessary and appropriate for the FY23 budget. Reallocation is our internal practice of finding efficiencies or purposely reducing or eliminating expenditures on a recurring basis in order to reinvest existing resources in new things. In some years, we are in the position of implementing exceptionally large expense reductions, potentially for 2 purposes, in part to offset a loss of revenue, and in part as a reallocation to cover cost increases or higher priority investments which don't go away even when the revenues drop. In 7 of the last 8 years, we reallocated 1 to 2% of total unit allocations on a recurring basis. So that does not include the one-time spending reductions implemented to address the pandemic shortfalls that we spoke about just a little bit ago. This year, our average reallocation across all units was particularly high at 2.5%. The magnitude of recurring reallocations has not been implemented across the board. The decisions have differed by unit based on their needs and opportunities and their unique financial situations. The goal here continues to be to find or create opportunities to gain efficiencies and lower costs or slow them down, and to do so while maintaining quality across the board. Moving forward, we have to choose how deep to push the budget reductions for FY23. Shouldn't have done that yet. Each 1% reallocation target on the traditional base of state and tuition funds reduces existing costs by $20 million. So to pull it all together, we want to show you 2 things: the primary variables we need to make decisions about, all on one slide, and some example hypothetical budget frameworks to demonstrate how those decisions can lead to a plan. So first, the variables. These are the primary budget variables to consider for next year: the resources on the left and the costs on the right. Again, this is focused on the framework funds of state appropriation and tuition. But first, let me say that some of the math in this table is pretty simple. We just wanted to give you some basic building blocks for questions or scenario playing if you so choose. There's very little that we know or is definite at this point. On the resource side, we know what the available increase is in the state appropriation, 2.5 million. On the cost side, we know that even without an increase in the salary pool, we will face a net increase of $4 million in fringe benefits. And the minimum cost increases for facilities and technology, totaling 1 to 2 million in the lower right quadrant of the chart, are also known. The other numbers on this slide are estimates attached to different assumptions. Now, for the hypothetical example scenarios, on this slide, we've displayed 2 different example frameworks using information from the previous slide. Please note that what we actually end up with will not be any of these, as you see, or probably any variation that we could talk about today. They are meant to show you that making decisions for a variable on one row has a direct impact on other rows, and there are multiple ways to pull it all together. You can see here that in both examples, there are certain cost items that remain roughly the same. Those things we know, lines 16, 18, and 19. But you can also see that the ability to provide a salary increase and to provide programmatic investments can change considerably depending on the resource decisions above. Adjusting the tuition and reallocation assumptions leads to different possible decisions on what can be spent on salary increases and strategic investments. For example, moving to the higher salary increase in example 2, the gold example here, compared to example 1, required an increase in the tuition rates, an increase in the expected reallocations or budget cuts, and a drop in the strategic investment pool on line 20 in order to make it all balance. There are very many combinations we could model here. The picture at this 30,000 foot level is a guide that can provide a starting point for the planning process. We're halfway through our task of meeting with all the units across the university to determine what their challenges and opportunities are, and we will learn a lot through that process that allows us to continually refine these variables until we get down to the final version that the president wants to recommend to you for approval. It's that process of gaining an understanding of unit level budgets combined with the goals of the institution and the strategic plan that helps us to make decisions on the variables and arrive at a final balanced version. Your thoughts and input throughout the process, including today, is part of that cycle. It helps us to shape the answers to the variable questions. And so with that, Madam Chair, that's the end of my remarks. We're happy to engage in a conversation on the budget.
Did you want to add anything, Senior Vice President France? All right. Vice President Tonneson, thank you. My initial reaction is, wow, a lot to absorb, and I won't ask you to repeat it. If anybody wants to know what you said, they'll can go listen to the recording. Let's see if we have any questions or comments for discussion, starting with Chair Powell.
Thank you, Chair Mayron, and thank you again, Julie, for making something that's really complicated and walking us through it so we can follow the thread all the way through. It's really, really helpful. So, and I especially appreciated the discussion of the the expected increases in resources that will come from the internal endowment and from the foundation, due to strong market performance. And I guess what I took from that is that most of those increased resources are restricted by the terms of the gift, but that some of it actually does flow through into the operating budget, creates some budget flexibility or fungibility. And I think you showed us a number called unit revenue increases of 9 million. Is that, I mean, did I interpret that the right way? Is there some additional resource that we can expect from that? And if so, how much? Or is all of the additional endowment income basically locked up in restrictions?
Chair Mayron, Regent Powell, I would tell you that in a given year, we can expect some small amount of those dollars to make its way through to that line in the framework. I cannot tell you how much. And the reason is that it is all restricted. I mean, pretty much it's highly restricted. But where it can make a difference, for example, is where, let's say a college has been funding a faculty position with O&M dollars, and they get a new endowment or have the expanded ability of an existing endowment to move that salary over to the endowment earnings. They will propose that. And then it becomes part of that other unit revenues line, because we're moving an O&M funded expense off of that ledger, if you will, and onto the other revenues. So then it will hit that line and we can count it. But it varies by year and it varies by unit. So I can't give you an exact number, but I do anticipate there will be some amount of that, and perhaps more because of the growth in the endowment.
A follow-up question, Chair.
Yes, go ahead.
I don't really have 100% recall on this, but I think that the rate of increase is lagged over 10 or 12 quarters or something like that. And given the extraordinary circumstances of the pandemic and now this very high inflation, it sure would be great, if those endowment funds could, take a one-time step, move it forward, because we need it would be great to get the assistance sooner rather than later.
Any reaction to that?
I'm Madam Chair, Regent Powell. I don't think I'm the right person to answer that question or that comment. I feel fortunate actually that I could. I actually, Chief Investment Officer Stuart Mason is in the room if you'd like him to respond to that. I just would say that I feel fortunate that there will be these automatic increases over the next 5 years. It's $78 million a year. And I think that's going to help a lot of our units. Again, the funds are restricted largely, so it's not that they can use it for whatever, but it will be helpful.
All right. Yeah, I think I'll leave Stuart alone. I don't know if Senior Vice President Franz wants to comment on it, but if not, I'm good. Thank you, Chair Mayron.
All right, thank you. I have a question and then we'll proceed to others. The slide that dealt with the 3 different inflation indices, is there one in particular? I mean, which one do you look at? Because there's quite a variation between 2.7, the HEPI inflation index versus the CPI at 7.0. So in your professional judgment, is one more realistic than the other as to what we're going to be dealing with? Or does it depend on what the nature of whether we're talking about compensation or we're talking about services or goods or the kinds of goods? And so the answer is it depends.
Regent Mayron, it depends. Unfortunately, it really does depend. There are, and frankly, the HEPI is that issue of faculty salaries, market for faculty salaries, and what your market is, and so forth. So it's an indicator, but it's not the only indicator. There, we get information from our peers also on what's happening in that market. But for all of the other non-compensation related items, it really depends on what the business is and what the purchases are. in terms of which inflation rate is more relevant.
Okay, thank you. Student Representative Mergendal from the Morris campus, you had a comment.
Thank you, Chair Mayor and Vice President. I just want to share some of my concerns around tuition and tuition increases. I mean, I'm not opposed to tuition increases. I know what things pay for, but I am concerned that continuing to increase the burden on students without necessarily ensuring that things like student worker salaries, just staff salaries in general, faculty salaries, if those aren't really able to keep up with inflation, I'm just concerned that we're going to have a lot more issues with retention in those fields. We're already seeing pretty serious issues nationwide with lots of students dropping out, just lower retention rates in general, continuing struggles with mental health. So I guess I just feel better airing those concerns and ensuring that the needs of students are taken into account and that those manifest in more ways than just tuition. Does it go up? Does it go down? Et cetera. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Next comment is question by Regent Sviggum.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Julie, my first question was going to be similar to the chair's about which inflation factor of the three you would use. Would I be able to argue that the PCE at 5.7 is probably the most appropriate one to use for the average person? Most folks aren't in the situation of building a house where lumber and cement has gone up, 20 and 30 and 40%. Yet we are in the position of buying Coke and Pepsi and food and gas, which I think is probably more appropriately attributed to the PCE. What is your reaction? I want a little bit more from you than you gave to the chair.
Chair Mayron, Regent Sviggum, I guess I would add that I guess I would think that it is relevant for a good portion, more relevant perhaps for a good portion of the general buying public. And part of that is that I do like the fact that they make an adjustment in that index for consumption changes. So factoring in that if something is growing, the price is growing significantly, people back off of buying it. And that's kind of built into that index, that behavioral change is built in there. But it still includes, in terms of putting on my university hat, it still includes items that the university really doesn't buy very much of. And there are other things that we buy that households don't, gold and precious metals and gases and those kinds of things that most households don't buy. And so I really, that's why I try to make the point, and I really believe it, that we don't focus on one. We kind of keep track of what's going on in the general economy, knowing that it's going to impact our costs, but then we look down at the unit level in terms of what they actually have to buy and have conversations with them about what they're seeing in terms of price increases. So,
okay. Well, Madam Chair, to follow up, let me argue that the 5.7 is probably more appropriate for an average person, none of us being average, of course, than maybe the 7 or the 2. If that be the case, let me state and argue that we need to recognize that for our employees, for our people. Our people is kind of the wrong way to put it, but our employees are going to have to recognize cost of inflation in their life, and we're going to have to recognize that in salaries, and or we'll lose to the market, and or there will be other consequences. So as we look at balancing tuition, and yes, tuition being very important, but a percent of tuition doesn't balance a percent of salary increase. They don't equate, especially if you put fringe in it. So I'm going to make the simple argument that the only way we can address this is to go to a comment I made a half an hour ago with Mr. Horstman, and that our FTEs have got to be less, or we're not going to make it work. Simple argument. Because we have to recognize we got to give our people more money.
I don't know that a response by you is required, but I
No,
see
no.
that Senior Vice President Franz wants to say something.
I did not ask for a response.
Okay.
It was a comment.
Okay. So taken. Senior Vice President Franz, despite the fact he doesn't want to respond.
I'm a little nervous sitting between the two of you, Madam Chair, but I think one of the keys, and as we're looking out in the audience and see the four campus chancellors here and President Gable here at the Twin Cities, when you look at, inflation does affect everybody differently. And we all experience it, but we all experience it differently. And I think one of the things that we're seeing is if there's there's no more important resource than our talent, our people. And you're right that keeping these people becomes a budget challenge at times, especially during inflationary cycles. But you could certainly take the argument that Regent Hips was making earlier about strategy and strategic moves. And I think the key that I think Vice President Horstman and I have talked about, the key is recognizing that talent, keeping the talent here. I mean, it takes so much to bring on people and train them. So I mean, retention is like job number one. Recruiting is job number two because of the challenges we have and some of the openings that we have now. But we do have to be competitive. I mean, your point is exactly right. I mean, we can't expect to get the most talented people without dealing with the market, and we have some competition out there. So I think that is going to be one of our really big challenges: is how do we manage to deal with this inflationary change, but in a way that retains and recruits and maintains the talent that we have here, which at the university is just extraordinary, right? So,
Thank you very much. Regent Rocha?
Thank you, Chair Mayron. Following on that comment, taking it back to the tuition conversation, as we go forward and looking at the different options for us, all of them, challenging at this point, I would just remind the board that this last cycle, as we were coming into as we were moving through the pandemic, we raised tuition when the surrounding states, I believe all of them froze tuition. So, obviously that had an impact on what they're addressing. And, when you look at tuition at the publics in all four states that surround us, including, comparable universities at Wisconsin and in Iowa, our students, our undergraduate students, in-state students are paying close to 50% more tuition and fees already. Wisconsin, Iowa, and Dakotas are even less than that. So recognizing the regional market and recognizing the mission with respect to students, I want to put that out there that we're not talking about starting from a flat line with the other regional publics, that we're already well out of alignment in what we're asking from Minnesota students, especially at the undergraduate level. So when we start doing these comparisons, and then as it relates to the compensation issues, I would ask the administration to be very clear with us what total cost is. I've watched for many years now, we talk about salary in one instance and fringe in the other, and we're typically at the very top of the Big Ten in fringe. So as we make that evaluation of what the costs are, I want to make sure that we have a comprehensive understanding of what those costs, what we're spending as it is, and that's within that. I think that it is important that we have compensation that's attractive and that keeps our strong talent. I think there is a natural turnover at times that we should understand where we are with respect to that as well. I don't know that I recall seeing any kind of data on what our turnover is compared to other businesses or other similar institutions, but those are just a couple of things that I'd like us to keep in mind as we go forward and try to tackle this very significant problem. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Any other comments or discussion by any of my colleagues here? All right, well, thank you, Vice President Tonneson. I think you're off the hook now for this afternoon. And at this time, our third item is an overview of the university's performance management practice. Here to walk us through that is Vice President Horstman, Senior Director Brandon Sullivan. Vice President Horstman, if you want to come up to the podium and begin the discussion.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to provide an overview of a topic critical to the employment environment of the University of Minnesota, the practice of talent and performance management, or as we call it, TPM. You have already made comments about the value and the importance of one of our most important resources, our people. And talent and performance management is a practice that advances our Impact 2025 goals. It does relate directly to increased job satisfaction. It does help to provide a high-performing work environment that cultivates an inclusive and welcoming campus climate. And it does help us remain competitive in recruiting and retaining diverse talent. Feedback from our periodic engagement survey points out that faculty and staff feel TPM practices were important to the success of their work. When asked what one thing has been done to improve success in their work, staff responded that coaching, feedback, empowerment, work arrangements, workload management, and resilience all contributed to their success. Faculty spoke to recognition, empowerment, performance management, training, and growth opportunities. In fact, TPM practices present in the work environment were a significant factor that separated faculty and staff who said they were fully engaged in their careers at the university compared to those who said in the survey that they were disengaged or frustrated. The biggest differences for staff were whether coaching was available from their immediate supervisor and if they felt they were clear on the presence of a strategy and goals for their unit. Faculty desired clear and regular feedback. Faculty and staff who have left the university were much less likely to agree that these important factors were present. Today, I will ask Brandon Sullivan, our Senior Director for Talent Management, to walk us through how Human Resources is approaching TPM in an evidence-based manner toward the desirable goal of not just maintaining our talented workforce, but engaging them to develop and grow for the future. Brandon.
Chair Mayron, members of the committee. In 2018, we brought together a group of HR directors across the university system and a group of us from the Office of Human Resources to address the challenge at the time and the pain points the university was facing around talent and performance management. At that point in time, this was all decentralized, it was fragmented, different colleges, campuses, and units had different approaches to managing performance and managing talent. And we knew that this was not sustainable, and it certainly wasn't going to support the ongoing future needs of the university. So we did two things at that point in time. We first did an internal scan of the current state as of 2018 practices across the university. And the second thing we did is an external scan of what are the evidence-based leading practices in talent and performance management. We put these two pieces of information together and created the roadmap that you see in front of you. This is a very high level view of the roadmap. And what this shows is the work that's been done, the work we're doing, and then the work ahead. This is a journey, and this is going to be a long journey to get, well, there's no end point, right? This is ongoing work, but to get to the last phase of this. So I want to talk to you now about where we've been and where we're going. The first step in effective talent performance management is establishing why are we doing this? What is the purpose of this? What are the goals we're trying to achieve? How do they align with the organization's priorities? What are the expectations especially for those in supervisory and leadership roles? What are the accountabilities, the norms and practices? These can be very closely anchored to the Impact 2025 plan around some of the things we're trying to accomplish: recruiting, retaining talented, diverse faculty and staff, creating a sense of belonging for everybody at the university, creating an inclusive climate. And as we've been discussing, there are growing challenges around many of these things, particularly recruiting and retaining top talent. And so those are rooted in why we're trying to do this work and in the talent philosophy. We have a little more work to do on the talent philosophy to really translate that into specific expectations, accountabilities, and so on. That's part of the ongoing work, and I'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. The focus of a lot of our work to date has been on that next step, managing performance. This is a foundational element of all of this work, and you can't really do the other steps effectively until you have that down solid. And so we've been doing a lot of things over the last few years around clarifying and creating training tools, resources for supervisors, faculty, and staff who supervise the work of others, specifically around 3 key skills that are absolutely pivotal in managing performance. 1 is setting effective goals. 2 is providing ongoing feedback and development coaching. And 3 is effective evaluation of performance. Those 3 skills are foundational, and all of the other things on the roadmap cannot happen effectively without supervisors being proficient in those 3 skills. So we have developed a supervisor development program that provides training. Some of it is just-in-time training. You can access it online on your own time. We have facilitated online training courses for supervisors. We just launched a new supervisor orientation program for all faculty and staff who are new to supervising at the university, that introduces them to what does it mean to be a supervisor, what are the roles and responsibilities that go with that, and getting them started thinking about those skills that I just mentioned and how to build those. We're also partnering with Vice Provost Rebecca Roper's office on the academic leadership development program for new department chairs, and we're incorporating some of this content and training into that program as well. Another element of the work that we've done is there is a tool called the Performance Appraisal Tool, often called PAT. This was developed in health sciences colleges at the university several years ago. It's a homegrown performance management tool. And when we were developing these practices, we were able to adapt that tool to incorporate these practices and make that tool available more broadly across the university. As colleges, campuses, and units have been adopting these practices, we've also been providing training on things like goal setting and feedback and coaching that go along with that. And I'll speak a little more about some of the needs going forward. The tool that we're using is not going to be a long-term solution to this, but it has allowed us to provide these capabilities much more broadly than before. The next step in the talent management roadmap is around determining potential. And what this gets at is looking long-term at growth and development of employees. What would be some next steps for employees given where they're at in terms of performance, in terms of their goals, in terms of what they've demonstrated, in terms of skills for future roles. To date, a lot of the focus of that has been on leadership development programs. A lot of our leadership programs are aimed at helping to identify those who are interested and have the potential for higher level roles, and then developing, providing opportunities for them to get ready for those roles. For example, we have a college leads program where we work with deans and the college leadership teams to help identify faculty post-tenure and help get them ready for, for example, department chair roles or roles at that level. But those are leadership programs. What we're talking about with talent and performance management practices is having all supervisors able to do some of this work with their employees. So really, leadership programs are great. They have impact, but we really want to get to a point where all of our supervisors are able to understand the difference between current performance, future potential, and help support the long-term growth and development of employees. So we're developing a number of new tools around that. They're not quite ready yet, but we're developing tools for supervisors, practices, training, and so on to support that. The next step is assessing talent. And actually what that should say there is talent review process. We're close to having a talent review process draft ready to start offering to the university. I'm actually in the Office of Human Resources. We're going to be using it this year. And a talent review process, if you're not familiar with it, is a really structured way of looking at the performance of employees over time. So not just this year, but looking over time, identifying development needs, looking ahead at their future growth and development. And some elements of that are really important. One is you're bringing more objective data to the table to talk about talent. It's not just a manager's impressions or what happened last week, but it's really looking at what is the data that we have. And the other element of it is a calibration process. And when we talk about making an inclusive process, identifying and driving bias out of the process of performance evaluation and talent planning, part of that is you bring different perspectives to the table through the calibration process. It's not just a manager determining, someone's future, but it's a group of managers typically who would be discussing the people in the department or the unit and sharing their perspectives. And their, part of that is really getting at, sort of the full picture of someone's performance. Talent review processes are commonly used in leading organizations. We have some units here at the university that have very good, robust processes. We have many units that simply don't have the tools, resources to do it. So what we'll be doing is rolling out a process that can be used university-wide for that. Then the next step really relates to some of the discussion that's been had already here is investing in talent. So once we get some of these pieces a little bit more in place, this will allow you to then really look at, how we invest in our people. And I'm not talking just financially, right? We know that compensation is important, but we also know there are a lot of other things that are just as important when we're talking about performance, development, and retention. And so rewards, recognition, development opportunities, and a lot of these other kinds of things. But first, we need to get some good process in place to allow us to really understand and get on the same page around performance, around how we develop people, and so on. So that'll be a future step in the process. So together, this paints the roadmap. And I thought, given the conversation earlier, I just want to give you a little different lens on all of this. So I teach in the MBA program, and every time I teach the class, I have the students go through an exercise, and feel free to do this if you'd like. It actually can be kind of interesting. I have them make a list of everyone they've ever reported to, all their bosses they've ever had. And then they go through and put a star next to those they would willingly work for again. And then we do two things. One is we calculate the percentage that they would willingly work for again. And on a good day, it's 40%. I've had one class where it was almost 50. I was a little surprised, but usually 40 to 50%. And then what we do, and this gets at kind of the point of all of this, is we talk about what's the difference between those who have a star next to their name that you'd want to work for again and everyone else. And the themes are always consistent. The people I would work for again, they cared about what my interests were, what my goals were. They were helpful in solving problems. They were proactive in getting to know me and helping me get the right opportunities. And so as we think about, we want to be an employer of choice. We want people who want to work for us. And we know that those are some of the key things. This is what, all my MBA students want. And I think, we all want that too, and our faculty as well. So just another lens on some of this and the purpose of all this and how it can contribute. Thank you. We have a lot of objectives for this work, but I want to highlight three. One is to help us get a better handle on creating diverse talent pools for mission critical roles. One of the leading practices right now in a lot of large organizations is moving from more traditional succession planning and succession management, where you're sort of taking each person and sort of slotting them into another role, and looking more at talent pools. So looking at how can we develop a group of people, any of whom would be strong candidates for key internal roles. And this is helpful in a number of ways, but this is an objective of this work as well. Another is synchronized practices. We still have a lot of fragmentation and different types of practices, which makes it difficult to be strategic. It makes it difficult to get a view of, what is happening with our workforce. What are some of the key pain points, at a higher level? And this will help us with that greatly. And then related to that is more actionable insights. So as we put more of these standard practices in place, we put more of these tools in place, it will help us get more objective data on, where we have, talent pools we can draw from for key roles, where we need to focus some of our training and development, where we have retention risks that we may not yet be aware of. One of the things that will start happening as we do this is we'll get more leading indicators of problems that may be looming, but they're not there yet. If we don't have this data, you tend to be more reactive. Stuff's happening now. We see, turnover now. Well, there were probably indicators, before that. And if we have this data, we have some of these insights that will help us with that. We've had, a lot of luck. We have some challenges, and I'll talk about that as well. We've had a lot of luck gaining momentum for this work. So one of the things that is a really nice statistic, I think, is when we started this work in 2018, 0% of the university was using this. Everybody was on a different set of practices. We now have almost 70% of the university that are using these practices, and that is, to me, pretty amazing. For an institution that doesn't always move super fast to incorporate new practices. But I think this really speaks to the value that people see in this work and the need for it and the pain points that people are really experiencing that this is addressing. This also has helped to create some shared understanding, and we have more work to do here, but we were already starting to see this where different colleges and units are starting to use the same terminology and have the same understanding of talent and performance. It allows a lot more mobility across the organization. It allows a lot more transparency across the organization and efficiency. And then the last thing I want to call out is that we have been really focusing on supervisory skills because that's so foundational to all of this. And we have seen in the engagement survey some evidence that employees are seeing a really good increase in getting feedback from their supervisors as well as receiving development coaching. We know that from external benchmarks, both have gone up. The coaching one is our opportunity for a little more improvement, and that kind of makes sense because feedback is a little more of a basic skill. Doing more development coaching is a little more complex skill. So that's going to be a focus area for us going forward. And then finally, a few things that we're focused on right now in terms of kind of keeping this going and advancing. One is we want to move towards system-wide adoption of these practices. Like I said, we have about 70% of the university using these. We'd like to get that up to 100%. We know that those that aren't on these have other elements that they're trying to deal with. There's some unique considerations, so we certainly aren't looking to force anybody onto these practices, but rather to understand what would need to happen for those other units to want to adopt these practices and what some of those barriers might be that they see. Another thing that we are going to be doing is really more engaging senior leadership in this for two reasons. One is to help equip senior leaders with some of the skills, knowledge, abilities, and tools to do this work as we roll it out. But another piece that's equally important gets back to that talent philosophy, or what are we trying to accomplish with all of this? It's easy to put practices in place and have it end up feeling like an administrative burden and just a bunch of administrative process. That's not what this is about. And so we really want to learn from and engage senior leaders in how we can make sure this is aligned with the goals of colleges and the university so that it will really serve its purpose and get us where we need to go. So we do have some things we'll be doing this year along those lines. Continued focus on supervisory skills, that's always going to be a critical element of this. A classic failure point in this work in organizations is when you don't do that, then everything kind of falls apart. So that's going to always be a real focus for us. And then finally is looking at the technology needs. So we have that performance appraisal tool. It is a homegrown tool. It has done a nice job so far, but it is not something that can really support the long-term or the system-wide needs of the university. And there are a few units that are using their own systems because our homegrown system isn't quite meeting the needs that they have. So we're going to be exploring that as well over the next year or so. So that concludes my presentation. So I'll welcome questions, comments.
All right, thank you very much, Vice President Horstman and Senior Director Sullivan. Any questions or comments by members of the board? Yes, Regent Sviggum.
Madam Chair, not directly to the presentation, I'm sorry for that, but since I have Mr. Horstman here, and I've referred to him a couple times, Mr. Horstman, to help Julie's, BP Tonnison's levers in putting together the budget, because of the salary freeze pause of 1.5 years ago, how many hundreds of FTEs are we down?
984.
984.
As of the end of last year, over the last 2 years.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Horstman. Thank you.
Any further follow-up? Regent Sviggum.
No,
Okay,
good number, Madam
okay,
Chair. Good
all
number.
right. Regent McMillan.
Thank you, Chair Mayeron. I did not expect that conversation to end that quickly.
No need to explain.
Usually there's some give and take there, but anyway, that is a good number, and Vice President Horstman came well prepared. Senior Director Sullivan, I think this one comes to you, but it may go to others too. So I'm thinking back to what I call your, not a ladder diagram, but the one that walked up from good practices all the way up to the moving from left to right. And up in that upper right platform was a topic that has, for the past decade kind of consumed me at times. How does this industry, not this institution so much, but find a way to focus more on internal leadership development? And up under that one, you had leadership development. And I think, all this fits under a broader heading of talent development. But tell me a little bit more, whoever from the whole group of assembled leaders here, perhaps you know, how we see that coming to life, and assure me that it isn't in order as we go. You're working on things on the right side of the chart at the same time we're doing job family descriptions and putting the tools for centralized or better performance reviews, all those things online. Those are all tools, but at the end of the day, finding ways to encourage and develop and then promote folks internally, to me, is just an overarching goal that I think this industry could do better at.
Chair Myron, Regent McMillan. Yeah, I would definitely welcome other perspectives as well from other leaders in the room. But yeah, one of the leading trends right now that we're seeing in organizations is really looking more at sort of mobility, whether it's internal, external. So where is talent coming from? Sometimes it's coming from within your organization. Sometimes it's coming from outside your organization. Sometimes it's people who come back to your organization who were there before. We're used to thinking of it in terms of like there's recruiting, there's talent acquisition, there's internal development. These are all starting to really kind of come together now because for lots of reasons that we've actually been talking about. And there is a lot of research showing that leaders who are developed internally and move into higher level roles tend to be more successful. That doesn't mean you don't hire people externally, but it does mean that there is some value for sure in developing people internally for leadership roles. And I think in a healthy organization, you have a mix and you figure out what sort of mix serves your organization best. It also is critical for retention. We know that a lot of times we lose people because they didn't know what the next step was going to be. They didn't see opportunities for the next step, so they go to another organization where they have that. So I think that as we do this work, and that's part of why one of the priorities for this year is to really engage senior leaders in this work, is to try to identify ways we can support internal talent mobility and leadership development. There's a lot going on now, but is to really look at how we can maybe be more strategic and coordinated about that.
Any follow-up? All right, Regent Powell.
Thank you, Chair Mayron. And really, Regent McMillan asked the question that I was going to ask. So I'll maybe just make a comment, which is that, I think, yes, I think, developing leaders internally is a really positive practice for all the reasons that Senior Director Sullivan, mentioned. I guess what would be really helpful and interesting would be to, at a later meeting, understand how the university thinks about this, what is the right mix, and when do you decide if you're going to, you have the resources to fill something internally? When do you decide you got to go, externally? And there's a lot of value in bringing in people from outside, of course, but to me, all of that's a bit of a mystery. We seem to do a lot of external recruiting. Maybe that's the norm. I mean, I'm not necessarily against that, but I think some greater clarity on how we think about internal versus external succession would be really helpful.
All right, thank you very much. Any further discussion or comments by any of my colleagues? All right, thank you very much to both of you. At this time, the next item on the agenda is review of a proposed amendment to the Board of Regents policy, property and facility use. The proposed amendments build on a conversation the committee had in September regarding principles to guide strategic property acquisitions and sales. Assistant Vice President Leslie Krieger will take us through the amendments. Senior Vice President Franz, would you like to get us started on this item?
I would. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Assistant Vice President Krieger. As you know, last September, this committee had a really good discussion on the set of principles to guide strategic real estate acquisitions and sales. And at that meeting, the feedback of the committee was on the principles was very, very helpful to us. And the discussion led to the ability for us to finalize the principles that ensure that our real estate strategies are aligned with board priorities and with the university's Impact 2025 strategic plan. So later in October, we were directed by the committee to really incorporate this approval land use principles into to a revised Board of Regents policy called property and facility use. After updating that policy, we consulted with board staff, Senate Committee on Finance and Planning, and chancellors. And the updated board policy that's now going to be presented to you today is for review. And unless there are concerns raised, we will bring the policy to the full board for action in May. With that, Madam Chair, I'd ask permission for Assistant Vice President Krieger to take over.
All right, Assistant Vice President Krieger, take over.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. As Chair Mayron and Senior Vice President Franz just noted, today's proposed policy amendments are intended to implement the direction we received from the Finance and Operations Committee in September of this past year, where we reviewed with you the proposed strategic real estate principles in alignment with the direction given in Impact 25. Today's proposed revisions to board policy are the articulation of the principles in policy form, as well as a refinement of the current policy language. The proposed revisions govern both the university's real estate assets as well as our facilities across the University of Minnesota system. These land holdings and facilities reflect an extensive portfolio across the state, as you'll note on the slide below. As Senior Vice President Franz noted, we did follow an extensive consultation process this fall in order to get to the place we are today. And the key changes to this policy include the following. The draft policy guides our future acquisition and disposition of real estate, as well as the property and facilities. We have a new title for the policy, Real Estate and Facilities, and that reflects the expanded guidance that the policy now provides. Per our discussion at the September committee meeting, the 4 new principles that will guide the acquisition and disposition of property include supporting the university's mission, aligning with campus plans, providing that strategic value while minimizing financial liability, and positively impacting the areas adjacent to the university or limiting negative impact. In developing these draft principles, it's important to strike the balance between providing high-level, memorable, and strategic direction, but enough detail to actually provide guidance for our decision-making. And as a result, the draft policy found on page 59 of your docket includes additional detail to further articulate the intention of each principle, as we reviewed with you in September. In addition to the guiding principles for the acquisition and disposition of real estate, the draft policy also articulates the guiding principles for the use of property and facilities. As you will note from the draft policy amendments on page 59, these principles were already reflected in the original property and facility use policy. In this case, the proposed revisions are merely refine and clarify the existing language. And although there's nuances among these 2 sets of principles, one for real estate acquisitions and dispositions, and then one for property and facilities use, first and foremost, both sets of principles focus on the theme that our property and facilities exist to advance the mission of the university. They also exist in alignment with campus plans, but also must consider the financial realities in which we operate, as well as the fact that as a public institution, decisions about property and facilities can impact and support the broader community. And with that, I conclude my presentation and stand for questions. I'm happy to see that Regent Sviggum has left the room so that I don't have to answer any specific
Oh, good.
specific questions like Vice President Horstman. Oh.
8:55. Here comes 8:55 now.
All right, we will open this up for discussion and we will await Regent Sviggum's comments down the road. Any comments by anyone here on the proposed policy? In particular, as you know, what we're looking for is any reaction, any changes, anything of substance you'd like, so that administration knows where to go and can present us with a resolution for our action at the next meeting in May. Regent McMillan?
Thanks, Chair Mayor. I don't have anything specific on the wording and the changes. I like the general direction. I like the broadened scope. I like the name. I guess my question would be this, and that is, some of our campuses have fresh, new, recently updated master plans. Some of them don't. And I think what we need to make this really work is some degree of dynamicism in between the two, so that as, for instance, Crookston finishes a campus master plan, it fits within and yet leaves enough room for, you know, their individuality, and I'm making up the example here, so that it's not driven by that, you know, a campus master plan that comes with a new chancellor at a place in 2 years will still work with what we have here. And that's just one comment. I don't know if you've got thoughts about how we should think about that interplay between campus master plans and then these policies. And secondly, I think this gives more guidance and opens the door to this kind of mysterious and mythical idea of land banking. And I know that it was intended to do that, and I don't have anything specific to comment on. I like that. I've always been a proponent of land banking. I think it takes a long view from administration and leadership, and then a long view from this board to support it. But it is something we should be doing, not necessarily right now in inflated real estate times, but over the next 10, 20 years, we ought to be putting some money or some land in the bank, so to speak. So directionally, I'm extremely supportive, and just probably need to read it again and think about how campus master plans will work with this.
Before you respond, or Senior Vice President Franz, I do note that in the proposed changes, subdivision 1B does talk about campus master plans and coordinating with them. So we may want to focus on that. And then I think the question that Regent McMillan is asking about land banking, is that contemplated here within the proposed language of the policy? And if so, where? And if not, why not?
Thanks for adding clarity and specificity to my question. It's a Swiggum-ish type thing. Very good. So
You're welcome.
Chair Mayron, Regent McMillan, to answer your first question related to alignment with campus master plans, that is definitely the intention. And so I put this slide back up on the screen that notes the system-wide strategic plan direction, because the one that's highlighted here is about that land retention, acquisition, and use strategy. But the first bullet under that action step is about establishing those new long-term physical master plans for each campus. And so, as you know, we just finished the Twin Cities campus master plan, and we are now starting the process for the next campus master plans, with the goal of having them completed by 2025. And so we'll be bringing those back to you as we pursue that process. But one of the reasons why the real estate functions almost 4 years ago were combined with the campus planning functions into this new unit, planning, space, and real estate, that I lead, was to ensure that we had greater alignment between our real estate strategy and our campus planning strategies. And so that, again, the real estate, the work that I do in acquiring property and presenting to you acquisitions and dispositions and leases on a regular basis, are intended to be directly in alignment with those campus plans or our system-wide strategic plans. So in the coming months, hopefully you'll be seeing some acquisitions, for example, related to farm. and that you reviewed this morning. And so again, it's about bringing that direct alignment between the mission of the university and how it gets implemented through our real estate strategy. And those campus plans are a component of that, which then also drives the land banking strategy that you noted. And that is really intended in subdivision C, when we're talking about strategic value when balanced against scarce resources and minimizing financial liability, our intent, as well as the campus planning piece. And so as we think about some of the land banking strategies that we've considered over this past few years, for example, the Classic City apartments that we acquired, that's a land banking, long-term land banking strategy that is intended to directly support the expansion of our clinical campus enterprise in the southeast quadrant of the Minneapolis campus. And so that's a good example of how we're going to use land banking strategies, but thinking about the financial components that go along with that. Do we have a pro forma that can support that long term? And then how does that actually directly align with our campus plan? So they all fit together, I think, pretty nicely.
Any follow-up, Regent McMillan?
No, thank you.
So just so I'm clear, then the concept of land banking then is captured by subdivision 1C, is that correct?
Chair Mayron, I believe it's captured by subdivision 1C, but it also does fit in, it's also part of 1B as well in terms of those campus plans, because we shouldn't be banking, we shouldn't pursue a land banking strategy if it's not part of or envisioned for the long-term expansion of the campus.
Thank you. Regent McMillan?
Yeah, thank you, Chair Mayron. I said no, and then as that dialogue unfolded, I just want to take it one step further. So that is the three-part piece of one that I was thinking of, and I framed that as land banking. It doesn't say that in there, but I think we all tend to like that moniker. And let me ask this question, and this may go all the way to President Gable. Once we approve this, assuming we do at an upcoming meeting, is there a sense, this is a pointed question, that this board would support a land banking strategy if you brought the right one before us? Because I hope it is, because that's something I think we want to do. And maybe it's opportunity specific and you can't answer it generally, but that's always going to be a question. What will the board support? And this is big ticket money in a lot of cases. So I guess I'm just taking this dialogue a step deeper to say, I hope we as a board get behind what this policy now explicitly says.
Senior Vice President Franz, did you want to respond, or President Gable? Which way are we pointing? Oh, we're pointing to this man. All right. Senior Vice President Franz.
Chair Mayron and Regent McMillan, thank you. I think one of the key issues for land banking is to do it for a reason. As Assistant Vice President Krieger mentioned, we want to be very strategic about that. And we're already engaged in that with 2407, property to the east of the stadium, and also the University of Minnesota Foundation is doing their own version of that with their East Gateway plan. So the goal from our point of view is to make sure that whatever land banking strategies we come to you with, that they're part of a plan, they're part of a process to get us to some vision. And those are the really good examples. Assistant Vice President Krieger mentioned another one. But I think to the extent we come to you and with a land banking idea that's not tied to a really good idea, you should ask some pretty hard questions about that. But I think Assistant Vice President Krieger would like to improve on my remarks, which would be easy to do.
All right. Vice President Krieger.
Chair Mayron, the only other thing I'd like to add is that this is not just specific to the Twin Cities campus. I think a great example of land banking is what we're doing at University of Minnesota Rochester. And so if you think about where our leases are in downtown Rochester, and that we have been acquiring property in the education district per our campus plan in order, and are land banking that for a future campus. So I think that's a great example of where we have a very specific land banking strategy in alignment with a campus master plan.
Thank you. Good discussion.
Thank you. A student representative, Mergendahl.
Hi, I do have one more question. In subdivision 2, part D, supporting the broader community is able, to what extent does this policy kind of cover community input on the use and on the decision when it comes, the decisions that are being made when it comes to these assets. I guess I'm thinking right now of Forest Reserve in Cloquet, where, you know, there's not necessarily universal approval there of the way of the university's activity there. So I guess I'm just, how does this policy provide communities with that sort of input to, you know, the university may see this as we are improving this community, but how does this policy address areas where those communities may not necessarily be in perfect alignment on what supporting the community looks like?
Chair Mayron, Student Representative Mergendahl, that's a really excellent question. I will say that this language opens up calls the question on some of these issues. And so from a standpoint of how do we support the community, recognizing that we also need to prioritize our mission. And so it is about a balancing act. And that's why we have both of those principles in there in terms of supporting the university's mission, as well as making sure that we are thinking about how our decisions impact the broader community. And so it could be, you know, as simple as in terms of using facilities, making the Robert J. Jones Urban Research and Outreach Center community, you know, conference rooms available for community meetings on Plymouth Avenue. And so the Cloquet Forestry Center is an excellent example of, you know, thinking about how do we strike the balance between the mission of the university as well as the supporting and understanding what the community needs are.
Any follow-up, Student Representative Mergendahl?
No, thank you.
All right. Any further discussion or comments? All right, thank you very much. We look forward to seeing the revised or the final policy at our next meeting, which I presume will be in May. And with that, we are going to take a short 10-minute recess, so we will resume at 3:05 p.m. That was fun. Ready to go? All right, we are back from our break. At this time, I would call upon finance, let me start over. All right, I now call the Finance and Operations Committee back to order. We now turn to both review and action on the resolution related to issuance of a century bond. To walk us through the resolution are President Gable, Senior Vice President Franz, and Associate Vice President Volna. President Gable, if you would proceed.
I'm sorry, Madam Chair, if you don't mind, I'll start first about the documentation
All
and the
right.
materials, and then President Gable will lead us off.
All right, sounds like a plan.
So what I'd like to do, and partly the reason I want to do this is there's a lot of material in your paper, in your books, and we try not to overpaper the book, so to speak, because you have a lot to read for the Board of Regents. And it's critical, though, that you get that information. And what happened in December with our discussion about the century bond in December was a great discussion about the how we go about doing that, the information about it. And so it was a really, I thought, a full-scale discussion of that. And then as we started going through the process and understanding the interest rate infrastructure, what's going on in our economy right now, we began to realize, Associate Vice President Volna and I, and dealing with our consultants, we began to realize that time is of the essence here. And so what we did then is we sort of accelerated this process and wanted to give you some additional information. So you'll see in your materials a resolution that issues for issuing up to $500 million in debt in the form of a century bond, along with information explaining our proposed strategy to manage the century bond and the policies and governance that we recommend to monitor and reduce the risk. So clearly, taking on this new role requires us to work out a structure with the board to have the right oversight in place as we go forward. Now, I've also included three reports. The first two reports are from Janney Montgomery Scott. This is the university's municipal debt financial advisory firm for this strategy. Now, they estimated that our credit capacity, and they reviewed our central bond strategy. They say it's sound and consistent with other century bond issuers. Janney estimates that the university's unpaid debt capacity, and I'm glad that Regent Swigum is here to hear this. They estimated that the university's updated debt capacity is $900 million to $1 billion on top of the existing university debt of about $1.5 billion. You can see there that we have certainly the capacity as analyzed by our advisors. Now, the other thing that we attached to this report was a short report from Moody's on the century bond strategy and experience. And one of the reasons we wanted to include that report was because of we wanted to give you a sense of the outside world view of century bonds and strategies, and it's been around for some time. And we wanted to make sure that that was in your materials as well. The other really important component of the materials is really the list of those universities, like the University of Minnesota, who have issued the century bond. And I can't seem to locate that list right now. Associate Vice President Volna, can you find that, where that list of the universities that have already issued century bonds?
It is on about page 77
Our material.
of your materials.
Yeah, so if we'll go there just for a second, that is part of the materials that we sent the board in advance of this particular meeting. So if you look at that list there, clearly goes back to quite some time ago, 1996 in Yale. But what you see there is the people and the universities, universities and institutions that have the capacity, the debt capacity, and the financial acumen to manage these kinds of instruments are among those peer institutions that we look to around the country. And as you can see, that the pace has continued to pick up from 2016, 17, and then in 2019 and 2020, we're seeing continued interest in this. So I think one of the things we wanted just to make sure that you saw that the par amount, the debt amount that's asked for or what's out there in terms of the total debt capacity. And many of these universities that we see in this particular page are AAA or AA1, and show you that the credit rating agencies will have to review our proposal. We'll be talking to them after we get a resolution approved and talking with them to review the processes. They want to make sure that we have obviously the resolution in place and the board policies and procedures in place to manage this debt going forward. They like a lot of credit rating agency issues, they don't like surprises, and they want to make sure that we lay out the issues in that way. So I think at this point, what I'd like to do is start the process here with Associate Vice President Volna, and then we can take a break when the president comes back because she has some opening comments she wanted to make as well, if that's okay.
Pardon? All right, Vice President Volna, if you wanted to proceed.
Thank you much, Chair Mayor, members of the committee. It's good to be here. I do not have a PowerPoint presentation. I will work off the materials that were sent to you as part of your board materials. I will primarily work off of the resolution, which should be on page 71 and thereafter, and the summary document that we put in, which starts at page 74. As Senior Vice President Franz mentioned, we also included a number of other items for you. And really the context for putting those in was, as he said, it's always helpful to get an independent third-party assessment of certain things. Janie Montgomery Scott did 2 assessments for us. One was of the strategy itself, and their kind of key takeaways on that were on the conclusions, which were on page 94 of your materials. They also did the assessment of our debt capacity, and I thought that was very important to do so that we could determine not just do we qualify, but can we afford it, and what would this mean in terms of our overall debt portfolio. And their executive summary, where they actually identified what our capacity is, was on page 97 of your materials. And as Senior Vice President Franz said, Moody's, I included the Moody's report as well. The key takeaway for the Moody's report is that there are only a limited number of institutions that can really capitalize on this, and we're one of them. They indicated some opportunities and risks there, but they point blank say it's not a tool for everybody. You have to have the credit capacity, the size, and the capabilities to manage this for 100 years, and we are one of those. So if you recall from the December meeting, the Century bond strategy that we discussed really had 3 elements. The first element was actually issuing a Century bond for 100 years. I'd like to talk a little bit about that in the context of the resolution that's in your materials. We're presenting a resolution for up to $500 million issuance of debt. We sized that $500 million number based on several factors. One was the 6-year plan. If you look at the 6-year plan that you approved, and you look at all the amounts that we will need to come up with for that 6-year plan, whether it's our 1/3 share of a state request, whether it's our construction of a facility on our own, whatever, that comes to over $600 million. And so $500 million essentially pre-funds much of the 6-year plan. We also took into consideration our debt capacity, as I said, and that's where the Janie Montgomery Scott report was very helpful. And also the marketplace. The marketplace will not accept an offering that is too small, and they will not accept one that is too large. Janie recommended something in the $300 to $500 million range. I want to just mention a couple things in the resolution. First, you'll note that the resolution says up to $500 million. We fully intend to offer and go to market for $500 million, but the up to number is a risk management sort of lever. If we go to market and for whatever reason the markets have said that we're more than happy to buy $400 million of your debt at 3.7%, but for some reason or other, getting that extra 100 million costs us a lot of money, we might not want to do that. Okay, so it gives us the flexibility. I'd also like to sort of point out the not to exceed language in the resolution. It says not to exceed 4.5%. I believe one of the board members asked us if we were, how they would be assured that we weren't going to do something dumb. I think 4.5% is my definition of a dumb interest rate. Okay, so I fully expect we won't need to get there. I fully expect we will come in quite a bit less than that. But we wanted to put a number in there. Actually, one of the schools that I mentioned in the materials, Claremont McKenna College, just issued a century bond in December. They had a number in their resolution, and they actually had to pull the offering and wait a week because they had to go back and get board approval to move that number up to what the market would accept. So we wanted to put a number in there that wouldn't delay us and cause us to do that, but we don't anticipate going to 4.5%. I want to make sure that's clear. Did the president want to make some remarks now?
At the end.
At the end.
At the end, okay. All right. You'll also notice that the resolution says I think it was for up to 101 years. It's a 100-year century bond, but when you take into consideration some of the mechanics of redeeming the bonds and such on the tail end, we didn't want there to be a technical violation because we're a month or two beyond 100 years. So our attorneys and bond counsel both suggested 101 years. So that really does cover quite a bit of the first part of the strategy, issuing the century bond. The resolution in front of you will accomplish that if you decide to approve it. The second element of the strategy then is the internal bank. And we already have an internal bank in place. It's a relatively small one. We will want to supersize that and beef it up so that as those proceeds from the century bond start to circulate through, we can accommodate that, and we have the skills and the capacity to take that scale. A risk management factor for the board that you should consider is in the resolution, we've indicated that we cannot spend any of the proceeds. We cannot start to work them through a central bank until you've approved policies, governance, and that whole framework. That work has actually already started. We're already working with our advisors to start identifying what are the policies, not only that we think the board might want to consider, but that the rating agencies also will want to see. Then the third element of the strategy, before I go on, we expect that there'll be some policy recommendations coming to you in June around the use of proceeds, approval over loans, and what kinds of review, reports, oversight, whatever, that you think you will need to see to make sure that you have an appropriate level of oversight of the central bank. The third element then is the principal repayment reserve. That's a very important piece of it. That's where we set aside some money in the endowment. We let Stuart's team and Stuart's successors grow that so that it's ready when we need to actually pay off that debt. We're not requesting approval of that right now. We think it's important to stress test that. And so we actually have stress testing going on the endowment to figure out what would be the right size that could accommodate almost any scenario. We think that number will be in the $6 to $8 million range. We will propose non-state funds. We will propose some other operating funds as a source of payment for that. We do expect to be making policy recommendations over the protection and the premature use of that principal repayment reserve. I think what the rating agencies and others will be nervous about is you put a number away today and it starts to grow, and in 44 years or 60 years, it's a big number. And will some future board, some future administration look at that and go, we think we have a better use for that? Well, it has to be protected to make sure that we don't short the repayment. So policy and governance around that will be an important aspect that we will be recommending to you. I've already mentioned some of the policy and governance framework that the rating agencies, and I think you will want to see. We'll be bringing those forward to you in June. That's the time frame we set for that. I also want to mention that this was one of two strategies we talked about in December. The other strategy was something different with HEAPR. Question has come up, how does this fit in with our overall capital financing strategy? This is one element and one stream of revenue or one stream of funding that's important for our capital financing overall plan. This will never replace state funds. We will always want to ask the state to help us for HEAPR. We will always want the state to help us on some of those facilities that are critical. But this essentially locks in and pre-funds our requirements for that for the next 4 to 5 years. So philanthropy will always be important, state will always be important, but this essentially gives us a leg up on our piece of that funding. The timeline, that we did include a timeline in the materials. It's a very aggressive timeline. I don't think we've ever issued debt in 8 to 9 weeks, but we do want to move quickly. It's a realistic timeline, but it's aggressive. Let's see what else. Senior Vice President Franz did mention that in the materials, there's a list of other institutions that have issued. Since that was prepared and provided to us in November, I believe it was, 2 other schools have publicly announced that they are going or have issued. As I said, Claremont McKenna College, an AA3 school in California, issued a $300 million Century bond. They got an interest rate of 3.775. Michigan State in December, their Board of Trustees authorized them to go out for a Century bond. They haven't actually gone to market and priced yet, but they are in the process as well. And then we have also heard through the grapevine that another Big Ten school that is not far from Michigan State might also be going out for a Century bond. So you can draw sort of a circle around Michigan State and figure it out, right? The other item that's in the resolution, rather than putting it in the consent agenda, is approval for our underwriters for the transaction and approval for our municipal debt advisors for the transaction. Those are 2 items that the board must approve. Barclays is who we are recommending. Barclays is currently in our pool of pre-approved underwriters. They wrote the book on Century bonds. They've done about 60%. They've underwritten about 60% of the Century bonds that have been issued going back to 1996. They're very experienced in this area. We are proposing using them only because of their experience, and we didn't want to be training in another underwriter on something that is sort of just unique. And we're recommending Janney Montgomery Scott as our advisors on this. We've used PFM, and they are in our pool for other debt offerings. But this again is something very unique. Janney Montgomery Scott has actually been a part of these in many cases, and we felt very comfortable recommending them. So with that, I've covered the materials. I will stop. Turn it over to the president or Chair Marin.
All right, before I entertain a resolution on this issue, pardon? Yeah, I was going to call on President Gable. President Gable, you're welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and apologies for doing this somewhat out of order, and also apologies for the extent to which this may be repeating what AVP Volna just described at the beginning of his remarks, which I was unable to hear. But what you've been hearing, of course, is a new strategy for us that is taking advantage of our very high rating and our very prudent risk management strategy, but also some very important and unique market circumstances that are fleeting. And so we want to make sure we're in the best position to do this. Of course, this is also, as Mike mentioned, part of MPAC 2025, action item 5.3, that looks at innovative financing that we have compelled ourselves to explore. So not only is this an interesting time to do this, it's also a strategic opportunity that we particularly described as we were, or opportunities like it that we described in the development of the strategic plan. So we've seen a lot of universities do this, as you heard, called the Century Bond Club. And we're in good company with similar risk management peers in terms of size, financial opportunities, and public obligations. who are also taking advantage of these very low interest rates to be nimble in deploying for capital and reducing transaction costs. So I'm delighted that we have the opportunity to explore this, and it has the full support of the administration as it comes before you for review.
Thank you, President Gable. I would emphasize that the resolution before us today is only to issue the Century Bond. The administration will return in June with a recommendation for a governance and policy framework for the internal bank that you just heard about that would be capitalized with the proceeds of the Century Bond. So now, before I ask if there are any questions or comments, is there a motion to recommend approval of the resolution related to issuance of a Century Bond?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
There I have a second. Thank you. Now let me turn to discussion. Any comments by any of my colleagues? Regent Sviggum.
Madam Chair, thank you. VP Volna, I'm very intrigued by our debt capacity and Century Bond concept. Very intrigued, and certainly the timing is right in the market. Good timing. My question is relating to the set aside revenue that we'd have to set aside and the protection of that revenue. How does, I don't think, and I don't know this, I don't think that one body of regents can bind another body of regents. Say a body of regents, none of us are going to be here in 25 years, right? The body today cannot bind the body 25 years from now. So what type of enforcement parameters we put in to make sure that it's protected and that 25 years from now, the board sitting here will make some reverse decision that's not very intelligent.
Chair Maron, Regent Sviggum, it's a good point. And most public bodies, most governing bodies, whatever the organization, probably can't bind something for the organization in perpetuity unless you were to literally give up ownership of it and put it in a third-party trustee. We would not recommend that. We think that because we have this unique asset called the endowment and we have this unique talent of managing it, it's best that we manage it. I think what we will recommend is that there are policy amendments made that would require a full and sort of transparent discussion and action by a future board to do that. I think that's the best that we can do, hoping that they understand what they're doing and what the consequences are. But I don't believe that there's, like you said, that there's a way to literally legally bind a future board from not doing something.
Any follow-up?
No.
All right.
That's
Regent
what I
Powell?
thought the answer was, but.
Okay. Chair Powell?
Thank you, Chair
Chair,
Mayron. And AVP Volna, it's kind of a tactical question, but let's say we go out and we're, we do get, 400 or 500, we're successful 400 or 500 million, which is, we'll start to, require interest support right away. So, we would want to deploy that capital, prudently, but, soon too. I mean, sort of with dispatch, do we sort of have a plan for where the first buckets of money would go so that we can get it into the operating units as soon as possible, and because they're the ones who will support the interest?
Chair Maron, Regent Powell, yes, we've actually done some modeling on the cash flows for the use of the proceeds based on the 6-year plan and whatnot. We will also be working with our friends in investments and banking to develop an investment strategy so that while we're waiting to deploy some of this capital 2, 3, 4, or 5 years down the road, we have an investment strategy that minimizes the impact on the operating budget by generating as much income as possible to pay the interest while we're waiting to deploy the capital. So we do have a plan for that, and we are going to be kind of refining that before we come back to you in June.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Regent McMillan.
Thank you, Chair Maron. A comment and then a question. The comment being, I appreciated your attention, AVP Volna, to the whereas clause that talks about the coming recommendations in May or June. about the governance and the role this board will play in helping assure that the governance of this internal bank is appropriate. So we'll have an eye out for that. And as a member of Chair Mayeron's committee leadership here, we've of course had lots of conversations about this. But anyway, keep an eye. We'll all be watching for that, and I appreciate your attention to that and yours as well, Senior Vice President Franz. The question, again, a little tactical. You talked about underwriters. As you total up all the costs that come with any bond issuance, especially one of this size and complexity, is the size of it sufficient to bring down the costs? I mean, maybe you need extra bond counsel, maybe you need, this has to be syndicated. I mean, you've thought of all that, I'm sure, but when you get to the end of it, money in door and then money out the door to support the issuance, I assume this is still the right move and that the size of it helps spread out all those costs.
Chair Mayeron, Regent McMillan, yes, we've actually thought that out. We have a rough estimate of what the cost of issuance will be. It's about $5 million, if I remember correctly. It's like when you buy or sell a house. There's all sorts of costs in the transaction, and that's no different here. So we expect that we will probably net about $495 million of proceeds if we issue a $500 million Century bond. What I would say is that because we were just out in the market last fall, actually we're able to capitalize on much of the work we did then and just update it. So that's actually holding the cost down a bit.
Thank you.
Any further questions or comments on the resolution or this program? All right, there being no further discussion, it appears that the board is ready to vote. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 All those opposed, please say no. The motion is approved. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next item is review and action on 3 collective bargaining agreements. Vice President Horstman will provide us with an overview of all 3, and then we will turn to voting on each resolution individually. Vice President Horstman, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair Mayeron, members of the committee. I bring before you today 3 collective bargaining agreements for your review and action. The agreements are between the University of Minnesota and AFSCME Local 3260 for healthcare and non-professional workers, which represents 191 employees at the university. Locals 3800 and 3801 clerical and office units representing 1,266 employees, and locals 3937 and 3801 technical units representing 637 employees. I want to thank the AFSCME local presidents, their business agents, and bargaining team members, and our own university bargaining team for the commitment and dedication to reach these tentative agreements. Negotiations began on June 1st of last year and did take an extended period of time, reaching tentative agreements on December 16th. The 3 agreements actually cover a time frame from June 21st of 2021 through June 30th of 2022. The June 21st date of 21 is actually the first pay period of this FY22 fiscal year. The docket summary provides the economic highlights, the main ones which include a 1.5% salary range adjustment effective with the first pay period of the fiscal year. A standalone bereavement leave benefit was agreed to for each contract. And the university and AFSCME agreed that the Office of Human Resources would establish a small panel of 3 individuals for the remainder of FY22 to review any concerns AFSCME technical and clerical may have regarding remote work. During the end of the negotiation, we also discussed and bargained on the 2 additional personal holidays, and those were agreed to as well. In addition to these main items, individually and across the 3 contracts, there were items agreed to regarding licensing, clothing, shift pay differential, retention in two small healthcare groups, and evening shift differential. The university and ASME also agreed to meet form labor management committees on the topics of transgender and gender nonconforming rights, on hiring, and on the respectful workplace. With this, I will turn it back to you, Chair Mayron, and request approval of these three contracts per the president's recommendation.
All right, before we have any discussion, thank you very much, Vice President Horstman. We will take up each resolution individually. First, is there a motion to recommend approval of the resolution related to the proposed labor agreement with AFS CME 5 Healthcare and Non-Professional Unit Local 3260?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? There being no further discussion, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, please say no. The motion is approved. Second, is there a motion to recommend approval of the resolution related to the proposed labor agreement with AFS CME Council 5 Clerical and Office Support Unit Locals 3800 and 3801?
Move
Is there
it.
a motion?
Second.
Having a motion and a second, any discussion on this motion? There being no further discussion, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, please say no. The motion is approved. Finally, is there a motion to recommend approval of the resolution related to the proposed labor agreement with AFS CME Council 5 Technical Unit Locals 3937 and 3801?
Second.
I think I have a motion and a second, and not from the same person. Thank you. Is there any discussion on this motion? There being no further discussion, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, please say no. The motion is approved. Thank you. Thank you to our presenter. And this brings us now to the consent report. Senior Vice President Franz, will you summarize the items in today's consent report?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, we have 3 purchases of goods and services which require board approval for video equipment and controls at Huntington Bank Stadium, production services for programming at Bell Museum Planetarium, and for automated external defibrillators for the medical school. We have 2 employment agreements for approval. First, the appointment of Robert Stein as Dean of the College of Continuing and Professional Studies. And second, an agreement extending the contract with Mark Coyle, Director of Athletics. We have a recommendation to approve some what we call off-cycle tuition rates. Just as for some of those folks who may not be aware, there are some programs that run summer through the spring, and therefore their tuition rates have to be set in advance of what we will be doing later this spring. Those 2 programs are in the Carlson School of Management and that you saw as part of your packet. And so we want to ask for approval of those tuition rate changes in the consent report. I believe that those are the items I wanted to highlight, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Senior Vice President Franz. Is there anyone who would like to ask a question, make a comment, or separate out an item from the report to be voted on separately before I invite a motion to recommend approval of the consent report? Regent Farnsworth?
Yeah, thank you, Chair Mayron. I'd like to separate Athletic Director Mark Coyle's contract for separate consideration.
All right. Then at this point, what we will do is I would entertain a motion to approve the consent report with the exception of the item relating to Athletic Director Coyle's contract. We will address that one separately. Is there a motion to approve the consent report except for that portion relating to Mark Coyle?
Move to approve. Second.
Any discussion on the consent report excluding the employment agreement of Athletic Director Coyle? Hearing none, all those in favor of the motion, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, please say no. The motion is approved. With respect to the item with respect to Athletic Director Coyle's employment agreement, is there a motion to seek approval of that particular item?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion on this particular item or comments by any of my colleagues? Yes, Regent Farnsworth.
Thank you, Chair Mayron. Just a few brief comments, and I'm gonna read here off of something I wrote just to make sure I'm concise and brief. First, I want to say that, I think we have a ton to be proud of from our athletics department. And as President Gable often says, athletics is the front porch of our institution, and I completely agree with that statement. Whether it's the phenomenal community engagement and mentorship programs our football program participates in, the Inspiring Young Announcer program featured this past week at Gopher Women's Hockey, or the incredible up-and-coming Minnesota talent, Gopher men's basketball coach Ben Johnson and his coaching staff are nurturing. I really do believe we have a lot to be proud of, and it's been an honor being able to see that from this role up close and personal. As I've stated in the past, I believe strongly in the public servant mission of our senior leadership positions here at the university. I believe it's important to center our public mission, timing and optics, performance benchmarks, the board's governance role and responsibilities, and other contextual pieces, whether when deciding whether a proposed amended employment agreement like this is within the best interest of the university. What gives me a little pause and unease at this particular time is feeling like we could have some more information on some of the aforementioned aspects as it relates to this proposed amended employment agreement. Given the substantial public nature of this particular position, along with the dollar amount, I'd like to see an improved process in the future for getting some of that information. I do plan to support the amended employment agreement today, but wanted to outline some of these concerns and principles for future consideration as we engage in these discussions. So thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, Regent Kenyanya.
Thank you, Madam Chair. If you'll indulge me in a brief soliloquy, I think I'm due one. I mean, we've had a lot of conversations about cost of administration, and I think we're, the good thing after 3 years on the board, there's no surprises. You generally know what everyone's going to say when they raise their hand. I feel personally, anyway, I feel like I've been a little inconsistent on the topic, and that's because my colleagues are very persuasive. I have my where I begin on most of these issues, but I listen and I talk with you all, and listen to the perspectives of market, of getting the best talent, the cost of turnover, and I often am persuaded. But then there's still some cognitive dissonance within me, and one of the particular areas is specifically in coaching salaries, because I'm aware this is not a coaching one, but because I feel the same way that I do on other administrative salaries, but I find myself being able to tolerate multi-million-dollar coaching contracts because they are generated from that unit or that team per se, and ultimately because they're not public dollars. I don't love it either, and I wish there was some change there, but I recognize, that would require, federal involvement or something like that. But ultimately, athletics is subsidized by the university as a whole, while certain teams may be revenue generating, the unit is subsidized. And, while those dollars are an investment, and I think there's value, any dollar not going there could go to lowering tuition, right? And increasing, supporting mission. When we talk about cost, it's usually on a specific contract, and many will say, well, this is not the time or place, or this is not governance. But I don't feel we ever come back to it. Then the next contract comes and the next one comes, and we haven't had that thorough conversation, whether here or, in a retreat setting. In terms of, one of the main arguments, which is market, a persuasive one, I don't know that we apply that throughout the university. I don't know that we're so stressed about market at other levels of staff and faculty. This morning, we heard from the chief auditor that a quarter of that unit, those positions are open, and I imagine the private sector is giving it more. In IT, I can speak to the fact that I know we're not paying, software developers and whatnot, what the private market is, and whatnot. And, students have long been pushing for, student minimum wage increase or things like that. I think some of our student jobs start at like 1033. My cousins who are in high school, they're getting $17 a target these days, right? So, that issue of market, I think we're very concerned about it at the top, but I don't know if throughout the university, that's the true. I majored in MIS, and my faculty were educating students who a year later would go on to make the same, if not more than them. I mean, not all of them, but some of them. And they were aware of that, right? They've chosen to work in a public enterprise and serve the public. I've heard from Wisely, on this board, that you can't cut to excellence. I'm also not convinced you can buy it either. I've heard this insinuation that hiring talent at a low compensation means it's low quality talent. I've thought about that a bit, and I think I just reject that. And because I think it'd be to assume that would be insulting to a lot of people who make that decision, who work in public sectors, who work in this university, knowing the private sector will give them more. And then lastly, I think to believe that, to justify that rationale requires believing that for a lot of these jobs, there's but a handful of people, right, out of the 8 billion people in the world that can do it. There's not a lot, but I think there's more than we give credit for in terms of that. And I am wrapping up, Madam Chair. I think the other thing that compels me is I've seen, I can see a lot of public policy where okay, for example, in Congress or something, you'll see like 80% of Americans or something like that believe in congressional term limits, right? Except Congress, right? These things where the people overwhelmingly believe in, except the people charged with making those decisions. In that same vein, to look at the student body, the staff, the faculty, the legislature, and really the entire state on issues of administrative pay and tell them, you don't get it, or to just conclude that they're naive and only myself and my colleagues understand that would require, I think, a certain amount of hubris about that. Like I said, I do second guess myself on this. I respect my colleagues' experience, much more business experience than I, legislative experience, advanced degrees, life experience, actually, but a quarter century old. But with recognizing that, I still think that those things that make me second guess myself are some of the very characteristics I was elected to represent, and there is a part of the population that mirrors that. I think all those things were known to the 200 legislatures voted for me. Bud Nornis was out of town, would have been 201, Steve. But anyway, I'll conclude with this. The beauty of this board is that decisions are made by, to quote the president, collective wisdom. I really do like that phrasing. So I think it'd be a disservice to the university to not offer my humble contribution to that collective wisdom, even if it does feel out of place at times. So I'll conclude with saying, without getting into the nitty-gritty details of the contract, I thought it'd be more valuable to offer my thinking that leads me to not be able to support it at the time. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, thank you very much. Regent Rocha?
Thank you, Chair Mayron. Not necessarily expecting a lengthy discussion about this contract. I first would say that with respect to our colleague Regent Kenyanya, I don't know that there's an inconsistency between the what's going on in athletics and what goes on in other parts of the university. When we talk about the programs that generate revenue and they don't take tuition dollars or state dollars, it puts us in a difficult spot. Certainly from the optical standpoint. And, you know, I respect your respect for the collective wisdom of the board, but the fact is, this is all uncharted territory. When I returned to the board in 15, this position that we're discussing today was at about half of this, actually less than half of this if you include all these other incentives. And so, you know, we don't, you know, sort of the future will tell us whether these are wise investments or not. You know, I would also point out that when we talk about binding future regions, this is, you know, this contract goes well past anyone's current term on the board. So we do, with great regularity, bind future members of the board, at least via contract. And so that's something that to be very mindful when we do something that does go so far forward that we're especially sensitive to that issue. You know, I can predict the response to that is that the market for these types of positions require this kind of longevity and this kind of assurance to both personnel. I get that. The challenge that I have with the contract is that you know, it's a couple $1 million contract. It's not just an extension. There are some revisions to the current term, the current contract, as well as an extension beyond that. But for that, it's a very scant amount of information in our docket. And this has been a frustration for me because I've continued to ask the question for a long time now, the questions about what are our goals, what are our expectations out of our athletic department, particularly because as it was pointed out by a previous speaker, we subsidize intercollegiate athletics despite the fact that intercollegiate athletics is able to generate well over $100 million.
Regent Rocha, can I interrupt you for 1 second? Your video is not feeding, so I don't know if you turned it off or, so we're only seeing your name on the screen.
I did not.
There you go.
But
now we can see you. You're back. All right, thank you.
Doing you all a favor there for a moment. But anyway, so back to the point. You know, I put forward a proposal in between, you know, prior to bringing Director Coyle on. And this was obviously didn't know he would be coming on, so this was not at all directed to him, but about putting forward a committee to come up with the goals and expectations of our intercollegiate athletics department. While it garnered significant support, it failed narrowly, and we never did do that. And so as it stands right now, when I look at this very sizable contract, and certainly for the vast majority of university employees, and in fact, the vast majority of Minnesotans, it's a substantial amount of compensation. I don't really know what I'm measuring it against. I don't know what to expect. You know, should we expect that the programs now start to self-generate and return money back to the university? Should we expect a certain level of academic success, which I think has been very, very strong under this athletic director, at least by reports? Or should we be expecting athletic success that we have not enjoyed for quite some time in the major revenue sports? Without getting into anything that's gone on over the last couple of years, I've been generally very happy with the way Director Coyle interacts with the board and with the community, and you know, the fact that I think he has been a good representative. We've had disagreements about some things recently with respect to what I felt could be self-funding non-revenue sports, but that's for a past discussion, I guess. So with that, you know, I'm going to support this, the contract. However, you know, I want to just make sure that the senior leadership of President Gable and her team, you know, this is really asking for a great deal of faith from this board without having, you know, something more in front of me of what we should expect to see for this kind of compensation, particularly in relation to this unit taking funds from what would be our core mission as an institution founding. You know, I'm counting on you guys to get us there, and you know, I guess I'll leave it with that. But in the future, with these types of conferences, I would really like a bit more information of what our expectations can and should be. I think we owe that to the people that we represent. Thank you.
All right, Regent Sviggum.
Madam Chair, thank you. Madam Chair, I had not planned on speaking on this at all, or even making a comment. I somewhat feel compelled to do so, obviously. And Regent Rocha, thank you for your support for this contract. For a director that does things the right way all the time. All the time he does things the right way. I don't care if it's the high graduation rates of our student athletes, whether it's the high GPAs of our student athletes, of the absolutely tremendous coaching staff that he has assembled on the front porch of the University of Minnesota. I think this contract, if I remember correctly, brings him to about 5th in the Big Ten market. I think that's the number I remember. And I don't think this is out of line at all for the performance that this individual has brought to the University of Minnesota. Somewhat to my friend, Mr. Kenyana and my friend, Mr. Farnsworth, when you make your comments, which I understand and I respect totally, but when you couch them in, this is what they would say, it loses a little luster, it loses a little depth of commitment to it when you say, well, this, I'm trying to answer what somebody else would say. You just make your comment. And I think that this contract, separated from the rest of the consent calendar, I think it's fine. But I am compelled to say something in support of the contract for an individual who has performed absolutely tremendously for this University of Minnesota. And I would hope that this would be a unanimous vote.
Any further discussion or comments by anyone here? All right, there being no further discussion on the motion to approve the contract amendment for Athletic Director Coyle, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, please say no.
No.
The motion is approved. Thank you. The last item is the information items. Senior Vice President Franz, if you would take us through them. Anything you want to highlight?
Thank you, Madam Chair. There's only one item I really want to highlight, and Vice President Tonneson mentioned that in her presentation, and that is for your information, the Central Reserve's estimates and allocation final balance are there for your review before we start talking about the budget in May. And that's the only item I would point out. The only last thing I would say from an informational point of view is the weather is deteriorating around the state. So as I look at our colleagues from our other campuses, please check your phones before you drive and be careful as you drive this weekend. All of you, thank you.
All right, thank you very much. I think that concludes our business for today at 3:59 p.m., 1 minute to spare. Thank you very much. This meeting is concluded.